All right, Jung Naiv, new episode, finally in English again, and we get a new guest. Who are you?
Hello, thank you for having me. I am Grace Blakeley. I am an author of these books, which you've kindly laid out. Well, this is actually the same book, but one is in English, one is in German. And yeah, I'm a writer. I write for Tribune magazine in the UK. And I am currently in the process of writing another book, which will be out next year.
What do you write about?
What do I write about? I write about capitalism, basically.
Why is that?
Because it's bad. Okay, no, so I write broadly from a Marxist perspective. So in my Twitter bio, I refer to myself as a Moet Marxist because one of the right-wing newspapers in the UK, the Daily Mail, kind of referred to me as a Moet Marxist, like a champagne socialist, but more radical. But I quite like it because it pretty much, it does characterize me quite well. I'm, from a relatively middle-class background, but also very focused on Marxist thinking and writing and explaining the way that the economy works, the way that capitalism works, that we live in a kind of class system, and just talking about that and why it's not working.
So you're fine with Moet Marxist?
I like Moet Marxist, yeah.
What is it? Like, if you could describe
it's like, so, if someone was to call you a champagne socialist, they would see it as like an insult, right? It's like, oh, this person,
because
pretends to be a socialist.
Because socialists have to be...
exactly, like poor coal miners or like whatever. But actually, this is what I quite like it because, Marxism as a way of understanding capitalism is actually just, you could be a liberal and buy into Marxist thought. You could be... someone like Schumpeter, for example, who was like a relatively right-wing economist and who kind of really wanted to like maintain and support capitalism, had read Marx's work on capitalism very, very deeply and said, this is a really interesting and profound analysis. So Marxism, it has all these connotations of being like a radical political ideology. And it is that, but it is also a way of understanding capitalism. So yeah, you can be anyone and be a Marxist. You could be a conservative and be a Marxist. You could be whatever
Really?
and be a Marxist. Yeah, because it is literally a set of, tools and principles that you can use to understand the way that capitalist political economy works.
What kind of tools do you use as a Marxist? Well,
So-
what is Marxism? Like,
This is such a big question.
The show is called Jung Naiv, and we haven't had much Marxists on yet.
I love that. So I guess the way that I often kind of approach this is to contrast like a Marxist approach to thinking about, capitalism and political economy with a neoclassical approach, so the kind of dominant approach that is used within mainstream economics. And so, let's say like if you're comparing like Adam Smith, for example, or one of those economists to Marx, Adam Smith focuses on exchange. So he says, capitalist economies are economies where there's lots of different individuals and they're trading with each other. And we focus on, what happens when these individuals or these, institutions, these companies trade with one another and how those interactions work. Marx says to understand capitalism, we need to focus on production, not exchange. Exchange is important in some ways, but the analysis has to begin in the realm of production. And when you begin in the realm of production, you're able to understand that capitalism isn't this kind of individualistic, democratic, decentralized system as it's conceptualized in the thinking of kind of many mainstream classical economists. It is actually a class-based system. And the reason that you are able to identify this when you start your analysis in the realm of production is because you see that the fundamental divide within all capitalist societies is the divide between the people who own the stuff and the people who work for them. So either you are someone who owns the means of production, the things that we need to produce commodities, or you are someone who has to sell your labor power for a living. And there are kind of intervening stages. There's kind of managerial workers who manage the production process. There's peasants and agricultural workers and rentiers, but that class divide between owners and workers is the big one that structures all capitalist economies. And then the third thing, so production, class, and the third thing is the Marxists view capitalist economies as tending towards crisis, whereas like mainstream liberal theorists view capitalist economies as tending towards equilibrium. So, you will that your Adam Smiths will say there is the invisible hand that brings supply and demand into equilibrium and that keeps everything stable. Whereas a Marxist will say, no, capitalist economies tend towards crises for a lot of different reasons.
So you don't believe in the invisible hand?
No, this is actually interesting because this is kind of what my next book is about. It's kind of really taking apart this story, the kind of Adam Smith story that says that, capitalism is this system of free market exchange, right, between individuals. Because it is the narrative that we all hear all the time. It's like, we can't have democratic methods for allocating resources because we need to have resource allocation undertaken by the market. My argument is that this whole idea that capitalism is a system based on free markets is wrong. Because actually we have within capitalist economies a huge amount of planning. Now, planning is often thought of as something that takes place within socialist economies. It's, you have the state and the state determines who gets what. But my argument is actually that in most advanced capitalist societies, you have a big apparatus of planning, the planning that takes place within large multinational corporations, which are able to decide, how investment takes place, the level of employment, how innovation takes place, all these different sorts of things, by states, which also kind of work with businesses and financial institutions to allocate resources, to define regulation, to kind of structure the whole economy, by big banks and by international organizations. So this network of planners, firms, financial institutions, states and international organizations, those are the people who are really determining most of what happens in the economy, even as they tell us, everything that's going on is just being, defined and determined by the free market. The free market doesn't really exist.
Like, give us an example for a multinational corporation who does planning.
Sure. So, Amazon is a great example, right? The whole idea behind like an economy that is structured based on a decentralized free market mechanism is that you can't really have market power. Firms can't really have market power. So in kind of liberal theory about the economy, the idea is that firms are relatively small. They are kind of competing against one another in a fairly level playing field. Mm-hmm. They can't raise their prices too high because then other firms will come in and undercut them, all these sorts of things. So they're very limited in the kind of actions that they can undertake. But in real life capitalism, rather than kind of just theoretical capitalism, a small number of firms have a huge amount of market power. And that means that they can not only do things like set higher prices without, being worried about someone coming in and undercutting them. It also means they're able to kind of set wages because they have what's called monopsony power, which basically means that they have so much control over the labor market that they're able to really kind of force workers to take a wage lower than what they otherwise might take, because there's this big imbalance of power between labor and capital. And you see that in, there are parts of the US and the UK, for example, where Amazon is just the main employer, right? So it has so much power relative to workers that it's really able to set the conditions and the pay of those workers. And these firms are also really kind of making decisions about the allocation of resources in our society that shape the future of humanity, right? So, think about Jeff Bezos has become, I think Musk has now overtaken him as the world's richest man, but he was the world's richest man. And he just decided, I'm going to go to space, right? So he's got this huge, pot of resources, this massive amount of control over the economy. And he has just made this decision, I am going to invest loads of money in trying to get to space, right? Mm-hmm. Now, were those resources governed democratically, we might make different decisions about how those resources were used. Were those resources allocated by a free market, then, there would also be a different way to decide how those resources were being used. So the fact that there are just this very small number of very, very powerful people at the top of the world's largest corporations who are basically able to decide how much, goods cost, how much people are paid, how technology progresses, how capital is allocated, how resources are allocated, really undermines this idea that we do live in a free market economy.
How does Amazon know or how to plan?
Well, a big part of that within Amazon and within many of the big firms today comes down to the way that they use and exploit data, right? So historically speaking, if you're a big firm, you might set a plan for the year, which will say, we're going to produce X amount of this good. It's going to cost this much. We'll, put this amount in investment. We will distribute this amount to shareholders. But today, when you have, the biggest and most powerful corporations are really able to kind of adjust what they're doing very quickly and respond to market conditions very quickly because they have so much control over our data, over consumer data, right? Amazon, for example, has real-time information about what people want, what they're buying in a whole range of sectors. Obviously it started as books, but now it's become, and this is Jeff Bezos's ambition for Amazon to become the everything store. So when you want anything, you go to Amazon and you buy from Amazon. And the access to that data, which is also something that, for example, Google has, right, in tracking consumer behavior across a whole range of platforms. It's able to then sell that information to advertisers and use that information itself to kind of decide how to produce things and to plan, basically. It's decisions around investment, around technology, around sales. So yeah, like data is a huge part of the business model of these firms, and it's a huge part of how they're able to plan. But more generally, as a firm with market power, you're really able to kind of set the conditions in which you're operating in many situations. If you're a really powerful monopoly, right, and you decide we're going to invest in a particular kind of software or a particular kind of technology, and you're able to harness so many resources that you can then make that technology the default option for most people in society, then you're able to kind of create the conditions that you're operating in. You're able to shape markets in a way that a smaller firm might not be able to. And so when you get really big, powerful monopolies, they're not so much responding to market signals as kind of creating the conditions in which market interactions take place. So that's like just a form of power that like big multinational corporations are able to take advantage of in order to shape everything, shape society, shape technology, shape the balance of power, shape, how much we get paid.
Mm-hmm. So if you think it through, Amazon still has competitors. Mm-hmm. What is the end goal of a company like Amazon? Well,
Jeff Bezos has told us what the end goal for Amazon is, which is literally to become what he calls the everything store. Right. And again, if you were to look to the way that liberal theory would conceptualize the goals of a firm, the goals of a firm should be just to maximize its profits, subject to all the constraints that it has, and to do so over the kind of short to medium term. So, that basically means that you are producing at the most efficient level possible and you're investing based on, lots of different metrics, including like the cost of capital and your predictions about what the future is going to look like. But broadly speaking, you're relatively constrained in terms of that goal, which is just to maximize profits, right? A firm like Amazon has a much broader and longer term vision. And it's not just about maximizing profits today, because, if you look at Amazon's business, there's one part of it basically that's really profitable, which is Amazon Web Services. The rest of it is not particularly profitable. Mm-hmm. And if it was operating in a different context, if it was operating in a more free market context, then its investors might have said a long time ago, you need to cut this part of the business, you need to scale up that part of the business, you need to reshape the way that this firm works. But because becoming a huge, powerful monopoly is the central vision of Jeff Bezos, is the kind of guiding force of Amazon, they're able basically to kind of avoid that short-term imperative to maximize profits. And they did that for, several decades. Amazon really wasn't a profitable company like a lot of tech firms for a long time, because they could tell investors, our ambition is to become such a big and powerful monopoly that we will be able to corner markets in such a way as to generate massive profits over the long run. And you're seeing this today because Amazon's share price has obviously skyrocketed over the course of the pandemic, and you've seen that with a lot of different firms. Now, partly that has to do with macroeconomic dynamics that maybe we can discuss later around central banks pumping lots of money into the financial system. But when you look at the relative performance of Amazon and other other firms or, big monopolies and smaller, more competitive, more profitable firms, the share price is basically investors saying, that very, very high share price is investors saying this company is going to be very profitable and very powerful over the long run, right? And it is now, relatively profitable today, but this is investors saying this firm is going to be extremely profitable over the long run.
Even more profitable.
Even more profitable. And why would you make that bet if you looked at the kind of, the basic dynamics of Amazon's business model? The only reason that you would make that bet is if you thought that this is going to be a massive monopoly. It's basically going to be able to kind of determine, it already is a monopoly, but it's going to become an even more powerful monopoly and therefore able to, extract profits, extract value from the rest of the economy by virtue of its size. In much the same way as, the big oil companies did in the US in the early part of the 20th century. When you have that much power, when you have that much market power, you're able to, force workers to take a lower wage, force your suppliers to give you better rates. You're able to push up prices because people don't have an option. At the moment, that isn't particularly that part around pricing. That is not part of Amazon's business model. Amazon's business model is to deliberately keep prices down in order to grow. But the ambition, of course, is to become as big as conceivably possible, which is not something that a traditional economist would say should be the goal of any firm.
So what comes after being a monopoly? Because you just said
well,
they already are a monopoly. Are they becoming the market itself?
Yeah, there's that. So Amazon is both, obviously. It's not both. It's kind of across so many markets. It is a market. It's, is like a tech company in the sense that it has Amazon Web Services, which provides cloud computing services. It has, all sorts of different arms that do all sorts of different things. It's across multiple different markets. But the ambition of getting bigger and becoming the everything store and expanding into even more markets is both about market power, but it's also about political power. And again, this comes down to another divide, I suppose, between liberal and Marxist ways of viewing the world and viewing capitalism. Because if you're a liberal, if you're a kind of neoclassical economist, you're going to say there's markets on the one hand and states on the other hand. Mm-hmm. There's economics over here and politics over here, and they're very different spheres of power. Basically, these two things are separate. If you're powerful in the economy, that doesn't mean you're powerful in politics. Whereas for a Marxist, they don't see those spheres as separate spheres of power. Political and economic power overlap. The power of the state is not separate from or a counterweight to the power of firms. Firms and states work together to reproduce capitalist social relations, to create the conditions for profit making to take place. So Amazon as a firm doesn't just have market power in a narrow economic sense. It also has a huge amount of political power. Now, you can see this if you just look at Amazon's interactions with governments and with kind of subnational governments around the world. It's able to basically go into parts of a country and say, I want tax exemptions, I want subsidies, I want this, and this, if I'm going to set up my Amazon warehouse in your area. It can wield that kind of political power. But also, Bezos himself bought the Washington Post as a way of expanding his control of the media, expanding his political power in that sense. Mm-hmm. And just, as an organization that is as big as it is inevitable a political actor. And you can see this with Jeff Bezos today being invited to COP and saying, this is what I'm going to do to tackle climate change. And, in many ways, the decisions that are made by Jeff Bezos as head of this massive company, this sprawling empire, will be just as, if not more important, as the decisions made by the heads of kind of smaller states. So, the way that we think about capitalism as divided between politics and economic states and markets doesn't really make sense, particularly today, when you have these massive sprawling corporations and financial institutions that can wield political power. And when you have, heads of states acting in such a way as basically to kind of support the interests of the private sector.
So let's say Amazon becomes a market itself. Mm-hmm. In the past, the market was regulated by laws and politics. Who's regulating this new kind of market by Amazon? Amazon itself?
Well, yeah. If you take the kind of neoliberal approach to regulation, then the idea is that all markets should be regulated by the participants in those markets. So self-regulation was obviously the big thing. But I mean, even when you look at, again, like there's this idea, I think, and it comes back to this question of the separation between politics and economics. There's this idea that states, that markets exist over here and states exist over here, and we can make markets function better when we have states doing good regulation, right? And this was kind of,
good regulation.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, what has happened really over the last kind of 40 or 50 years, aside from this trend towards self-regulation, is that the regulators have been captured. So if you look at what happened during the financial crisis, for example, most financial regulators, particularly those in really financialized societies like the US and the UK, ended up not only like failing to regulate the big banks properly, so failing to kind of enforce the regulation that already existed, but legislators ended up changing the regulation that did exist in order to favor the interests of the financial sector. Why did they do that? Both because the financial sector had a huge amount of lobbying power and was able to kind of target individual politicians to say, you should change your mind on this, but also because it has a huge amount of structural power. So, big banks can say, we create X amount of jobs, we create this value in your economy. You don't want to regulate us in such a way as to make us smaller. So this combination of kind of political and structural power of the finance sector meant that regulation was eroded and the financial crisis ended up being much worse than it otherwise might have been. So you can see a kind of similar sort of thing happening with big tech now. Part of the problem with big tech is that regulators don't understand what's going on. So they're very, very far behind. And there is this assumption that among the kind of tech entrepreneurs, that they can just move fast and break things, as they like to say. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness, because the law just hasn't caught up with them at all. But also they spend huge, huge sums of money lobbying politicians and going out into the media and saying, this is how important we are for the economy, to make sure that they aren't regulated. So regulation is always going to be, difficult to do well and also limited. Because no matter how, even if you got the kind of best regulatory architecture that could conceivably be designed in the abstract, that is going to be subject to lobbying. It's going to be torn apart by the interests who are being regulated by that set of laws. What is really needed is democratization, is democratic accountability. And this is, I think, where this distinction between politics and economics becomes important, because in saying that the political sphere works in much the same way as the economic sphere, why should those two realms not be governed by the same sorts of principles, which is the people who have the power need to be held to account by everyone else? We say that of our politicians. Why don't we say that of business leaders, of financial leaders, of, people who exist in
because
the rest of the economy?
own their stuff, Grace.
Well, exactly. And that's another part of it, which is why, thinking about different forms of ownership is also very, very important.
So, let's stay with Amazon. What's to be done with Amazon when it comes if Grace Blakeley could decide, democratize Amazon?
I mean,
why would Jeff Bezos say, okay, I'm going to share the power with all the Amazon workers?
Maybe you nationalize some of Amazon's infrastructure. Maybe you think about kind of forcing through a set of changes that would require companies like Amazon to democratize themselves. So like a very limited version of this is saying, even like in somewhere like the UK, where you've had a very long war on the labour movement, one step towards that would be removing the anti-trade union laws that have been put in place already, encouraging unionization and supporting unions to be able to hold bosses to account within the company, then changing corporate governance so that those workers would also be able to have a say in the decisions that were being made by corporate management, and also kind of having other mechanisms that would allow ordinary people to be able to have a say over the way that Amazon was being run and governed. So, for example, thinking about decentralization. The UK, again, Germany, this is less of an issue, but in the UK we have a very, very centralized political system. So all the decisions are made in London. Having a kind of a decentralized political system and having mechanisms for people to be able to shape governance at the local level. So, for example, like a lot of the way that Amazon has been able to grow has been by lobbying local and regional and municipal governments to say, we want like the equivalent of a kind of, special enterprise zone where taxes are low and there's no labor regulation and all these different sorts of things. Like having a more democratic approach to governance at the local level where big corporations couldn't step in and just capture a whole region of the country would be another way of doing that. Over the long run, I mean, I've like in this book, for example, I argue that we need to, the best way to kind of democratize the economy is to democratize the institutions that mediate ownership, which is the finance sector. So financial institutions, whether that's kind of asset managers that basically invest our cash on our behalf, or banks that determine, where lending is allocated in the economy. If you had to have a democratic financial system, you'd be able to kind of say, let's have national investment banks that are run democratically, so that lend to institutions that, or lend to sectors of the economy that we think need to have better access to finance. And I also argue in this book that we need something along the lines of a people's asset manager. So a kind of democratically governed asset management institution, financial institution that would invest our money in such a way as to socialize ownership in the economy. So if you had this asset manager, it was kind of publicly run, democratically governed, and it could buy up shares in different corporations and then influence the way that those companies were governed. That would be a big step to kind of really like just socializing and democratizing ownership across the economy.
But the small steps, you mentioned them, strengthening workers' rights at Amazon. As you said, Amazon would fight it every which way. Like, how could that be done?
Again, it's a good question, because this kind of analysis, when you realize the overlaps and the interlinks between political and economic power, it becomes very difficult just to say, we will just win an election and then the government will do stuff, right? Because the government, the state, is, highly influenced by the interests of the powerful. So the broader argument made by most Marxists, most socialists today is that we need to rebalance power within society. And that is a very broad set of goals that encompasses everything from, getting people out on the streets to organize for environmental issues, getting people into the labor movement to be able to kind of organize within their workplaces, having a strategy for engaging with political parties to influence those. It's basically the broader aim. If you take this, going back to what I said at the very beginning, take this distinction that exists within capitalist societies between owners and workers, it's about redistributing power from capital to labor. And that really means labor, people, us, organizing to take power back. Now, what we have seen over say in the UK, for example, over the last 5 years, we had a big campaign and a big movement that was really organized around that set of principles. It was about taking power back, ironically, taking back control from the people at the very top of society. Exactly, right? Because that was a warped reaction to the realization that people don't have any control and power over their lives, because this small group of people at the very top of society basically control who gets what, right? And that is a kind of negative and reactive way of responding to that. Whereas the movement that we had, the socialist movement, in and outside the Labour Party, that grew up very quickly when Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, that the vision of that movement was to say, right, the powerful have a stranglehold over our society. It's up to us to organize to take back power. And unsurprisingly, everyone from, people in the media through to corporate elites, through to, other politicians, were dead set against this movement being successful. First it was derided and they said, oh, you're just a bunch of silly commies. And then it was like, oh no, you're all evil and awful. And, we need to kind of stamp out this movement. And bear in mind that this was like, mostly young people or people around my age, like coming together in their local Labour parties and saying, we want to change society, we want to like deal with climate breakdown and like improve workers' rights and have access to housing. And the media treated it like it was some sort of, you know, cult or whatever. That ambition was really to, you know, to shift power in society, to say, strengthen workers' rights, get out into the street, have direct action, have ways of highlighting this central antagonism between capital and labour, and also have a mechanism for trying to infiltrate the British state and use the levers of power that existed there to shift power in society again. Ultimately, it came close, but it failed, as has often been the case with socialist movements in the past. But if you look at the relative power of that movement today as compared to 20 years ago, it's, you know, completely transformed. Like the socialist movement today is in the UK, in the US, across some parts of Europe, is more powerful today than it has been throughout at least the last 2 decades, probably really the last 3 decades. And we were obviously building from a low base after the 1980s when those movements were literally destroyed deliberately, often by the state. So yeah, I mean, that's the strategy. It's long and it's difficult and it's hard. It's about changing society. It's not just about kind of flicking a couple of switches and then saying, right, everything's better now.
Let's stick with Amazon. Like, let's say there are some Amazon workers listening to us right now. I mean, if you tell them, like, take the power back, they'd be like, we never had the power, so how can we take it back?
Well, I mean, the first thing that Amazon workers can do is join a union, and a lot more of them have been joining unions, particularly over the course of the pandemic. So Amazon workers are all represented by different unions, depending on where they are in the world.
But isn't the problem with the unions, like even Germany, that unions are kind of like co-management now? Yeah,
and I think that's certainly true in the more kind of social democratic societies where like the big unions have really kind of been sucked into the state.
Yeah, they want to have, they want their company to be successful.
Yeah, but like, and I don't know what the case is in Germany. I don't actually know who the union that would represent Amazon workers is in Germany. But what we have seen is that where the kind of big institutionalized union leadership has failed to represent these workers, they've often started new unions or joined different unions that are much more responsive to the needs of workers on the ground. So in the US, there's been a few campaigns where workers in, you know, Amazon, Instacart, Target have come together and had like a day of action where they've striked. And there have been a number of different campaigns that have been organized in Amazon warehouses and Amazon towns across the US. Some of them haven't worked, but some of them have been relatively successful. And that has been largely workers themselves coming together and saying, we need to organize ourselves. And
read Marxist books.
And read Marx's books. I mean, you know, you don't have to read Marx's books to have, I think often this kind of analysis is actually more helpful to people who are not experiencing that antagonism between capital and labor themselves in the workplace, right? I mean, you know, Marxism has obviously been very popular historically in factories, in industrial areas, like back in the past when it was very obvious that you weren't being paid very much and you were being exploited and oppressed by someone who was very wealthy, and you could literally see them because they were up there telling you what to do, right? Today we live in a society which is much more complex, in which production is much more kind of mediated, and in which a lot of people work in positions where it's not that easy to tell who's exploiting who and who's oppressing who and where the power is, which is why it's all the more important to have this kind of analysis, which is really about saying, where does power lie in capitalist societies?
But how do the Amazon workers in Germany or the UK recognize or see where the power is?
Well, I think, again, it's much easier for them to be able to recognize and see where the power is because they're in these warehouses literally being tracked with wearable technology on their wrists and ankles, which is saying, you are doing, you know, you're not moving fast enough, you're not getting the packages here at, you know, X, Y, and Z quick enough. And then you open up the news and you see Jeff Bezos is the richest man on the planet and he's spending the money he's getting from exploiting us in this way to go to space. Like, that is a pretty obvious dichotomy that I think most workers at Amazon will be like, if you can afford to go to space, why can't you afford to give me healthcare? Like, it's much easier to see that dichotomy if you're on the ground in those warehouses. It's much harder to see it if you're working at Amazon HQ.
But I mean, I'm sure these workers on the ground, they see that.
Yeah.
But they still don't rebel. They don't.
Well, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And again, it is.
Why don't they?
Well, because a lot of the time, capitalism functions by making people feel like there is no alternative, by making people feel powerless. And this is why in the 1980s, across most societies or across most advanced economies, there was a concerted attack on the power of the labor movement, because there had been several decades of strengthening trade union power and of workers basically saying, if we don't get wage increases in line with inflation, if we don't get X and Y and Z, then we will go on strike. That is very, very dangerous for a complex capitalist economy in which production has to be seamless, has to be integrated, has to take place in the way that the people at the top say it should take place. So what did neoliberal governments do? Well, people like Thatcher, Reagan, they went to war. They used the apparatus of the state to literally fight their country's labor movements until they were all but destroyed. And that's meant that the power of the labor movement has reduced substantially over the last 40 years. And as a result of that, across every OECD, almost every OECD country, you've seen the labor share of national income decline, which is the amount of national income that goes to workers in the form of wages rather than owners in the form of profits. And the result of that battle, the result of their victory in that battle, has been a pervasive sense that there is no alternative to the way that the economy works. Because, you're looking around, you're thinking, okay, right, I'm working in this warehouse, I'm being exploited, I'm being oppressed, but where is everyone else? Where is my solidarity? Where is the rest of my class?
Go on social media.
Well, I mean, but this is what people often do, right? And because social media creates very often quite weird communities that allow you to have a sense of belonging. You can end up being like, oh, well, I'm exploited in my work, go on YouTube, and then you're suddenly like a member of the alt-right or like into conspiracy theories, because you don't have that same, kind of ability to come together with other people who are in the same position as you and say, we can change things. It's that sense of powerlessness, really. It's like looking around you and thinking, capitalism is so big, the company I work for is so huge, there's no one on my side. There's no institution that is going to be able to represent me against these big, powerful people. So what's the point, right? And that is, I think, where a lot of workers have been, at least up until the last kind of 4 or 5 years, when you've started to see something in a lot of countries of an uptick in activity in the labor movement. And I think partly that has been a result of political movements that have said to people, things can be different. Like if we organize, if we like come together to challenge the powerful, then things can be different. We don't just have to accept things the way that they are.
So you mentioned the 80s. You were not born in the 80s.
I was not, no.
You're 28 years old, born in the 90s. When did you realize that you live in a capitalistic system?
Well, I mean, my granddad, who was a shop steward in the TGWU trade union, would have told me quite a lot when I was growing up. So I think I realized that I lived in a capitalist system pretty early on. I didn't really become a socialist until I probably like the end of university. I did politics, philosophy and economics at the most conservative institution in the UK at Oxford, which has educated many of our prime ministers, is just like, the bastion of the English establishment. And whilst I was probably like left wing, I wasn't radical.
How could you afford to go to Oxford?
Well, because I was the last year where the fees were £3,500 a year. So I had a loan from the government and I paid £3,500 a year. It was less than that, actually. Whereas now it's like £9,500 a year.
Where did you grow up in England?
In Hampshire.
Where's that?
It is a lovely, idyllic, rural area of the southeast of England.
Mm-hmm. What did your parents do?
My mother is an academic and my dad is an executive coach. So he basically works with all these business leaders that I've been talking about to kind of help them be better at their jobs. Mm-hmm. So I came from a very middle-class background, basically.
Did you guys talk about politics and capitalism at home?
Sometimes, yeah. Again, my mum had been quite radical, partly because of my granddad. So my granddad was a communist. He was like...
Are the Blakeleys like famous in England or something?
No, they are not. No, he wasn't like a high, a
the most famous
communist.
communist in England.
No, I wish. Yeah, no. He he was just a shop steward in a trade union. So
there were communists in England, right?
yeah, of course. Yeah, it was a communist party.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
communist parties everywhere.
Didn't know that.
Yeah,
Is there still a communist party?
there sure is.
But you're not part of it.
I'm not. No.
You're not a communist.
So am I a communist? I mean, this is difficult to say because it really depends on how you think of the distinction between communism and socialism. I mean, the problem with the communist parties is that for, most of the 20th century, they just ended up kind of blindly following the line of the USSR, which often meant actually being less radical than they might otherwise have been. Whereas, it kind of, that divide between socialists and communists, which existed in, much of Europe, probably ended up.
What is the distinction between socialism and communism?
Well, it depends. It depends. Some people say there isn't a distinction. Others say that it's about how you conceive of the transition towards a socialist economy.
What do you say?
I basically say I would call myself a socialist because I basically see that... So if you're a communist, you might say something like, we need to create separate, parallel state institutions that will allow us to govern society through a centralized party in the period where there is a transition from capitalism to socialism. Mm-hmm. As a democratic socialist, like I am, you're probably more likely to say, I think that we need to work to build power in existing institutions. So in, the labor movement.
Without revolution.
Well, I mean, it depends how you think of revolution. Like I would say socializing our resources so that we had public democratic ownership of most stuff in society, even if you did it through the state, would be, close to a revolution in the way that society operates. But it's not obviously like a violent revolution that takes place overnight.
Okay.
And I think, the meaning of these terms, they change so much depending on the moment of history that you're in. Like it's very easy to take a word like communist and then the things that come to mind are like the Communist Party in Russia in like 1917. But obviously if you are organizing as someone who wants to see the end of capitalism in 1917, you face a vastly different set of problems than if you're organizing today. So it's kind of difficult to draw really strong lines of similarity in terms of political strategy. Mm-hmm. What is similar and what is the same is the analysis that I've already talked about, and is the idea that ultimately the goal is to get to a society, a classless society, so a society in which that divide between owners and workers doesn't exist anymore because ownership is socialized, because we have common collective ownership of all the stuff that we need to produce things.
Well, in Germany, if you say I want socialism in Germany, usually people, conservatives and other people, are like, oh, you want this East German version, the dictatorship and all that. So it's like tainted, like the word itself is tainted.
Yeah.
But then again, like the now new ruling party in Germany, the Social Democrats, like if you look in their manifesto, they call themselves democratic socialists. Funny enough. But I don't think they are speak of the same democratic socialism as you are.
No. And I mean, I think what's interesting about that is like, a lot of people would say, oh, well, the difference between a free market society and a socialist society, again, is the presence or absence of centralized planning, right? So obviously in, lots of the USSR, you had centralized planning that was largely undertaken by the state in collaboration with a variety of other interests. You have a similar sort of thing in China today. And the big distinction there, I would argue, between those kinds of societies and a society that we have today is not the presence or absence of planning. It's who is doing the planning and in whose interests. So the balance, of course, between the public and private sector is very different in, say, China as it is in the US. But in both of those societies, in both of those systems, you have a constellation of powerful, influential people who have an extraordinary amount of power in being able to determine who gets what. Now, China is a highly authoritarian, system in which that power is very, very concentrated and centralized in the hands of a particular political party and a few other elites around that party. In the US, you nominally have democracy. There is, allegedly some way of being able to hold the powerful to account. You have rights. Like, it's a very different kind of political society and a political system. But when you look at political economic power in that country, it's massively centralized. And the ability to hold the powerful to account is vastly different for you if you are an ordinary person on the street versus Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Jamie Dimon, like the heads of some of the biggest and most powerful investment banks. And really, if you look at, again, let's say, look up to the period before the financial crisis, all the problems and kind of like irrationalities that were generated within the American and arguably the world economy in the run up to 2008, they didn't just happen. They were the result of decisions that had been made by politicians alongside bankers, corporate leaders, lobbyists, lawyers, etc., by like a relatively small and very powerful group of people who have made decisions about the way that economy works. If that isn't planning, then what does the term even mean?
You mentioned Jeff Bezos so much. Is there anything you admire about him?
I mean, is there anything I admire about him? I mean, what I think is admirable about today's billionaires is just their complete and utter brazenness in their desire for power. And often on the left, we're very suspicious of power, right? Because, rightly, we think that power is something that should be distributed fairly and democratically, right? But it often means that the way that we run our movements isn't very focused upon winning or achieving power or like getting to the place that we need to get to in order to change society. Whereas today's a Jeff Bezos, he's just like, no, I want to be the most powerful man on the planet, basically. And he has set about doing that. Now, I'm not saying that we need to behave like that because it's psychopathic, but having a much clearer sense of our goals and being able to articulate those would, I think, be quite useful for leftists.
I remember Bernie Sanders in 2020 in the election campaign in the US said, like, one of his campaign slogans was billionaires should not exist.
Yeah.
Does Grace Blakeley say billionaires should not exist?
Of course.
Why?
Why should billionaires not exist? I mean, firstly, because we should never have. When you're talking about a billionaire like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, you're talking about someone who doesn't. I mean, obviously they do have £1 billion in cash, but most of their wealth is held in the form of stocks and shares in the companies that they run, right?
Right.
My argument is that no amount of power, not just wealth, but power over the way that the economy works should be centralized in the hands of one person, whether that is, a politician or a business leader. The power of those resources should be democratic. We should all be able to decide how, the economy works, how politics works, how these decisions are being made. So I don't think that billionaires should exist. Obviously, I don't think that we should have the disparities of wealth that we have in the economy today. I don't think that we should have, one guy over there who's able to buy like Maseratis and, private jets whilst there are people who can barely afford to eat. But I also don't think that we should have this disparity of wealth whereby the people at the very top of society control our resources, control how decisions are made, control how financial markets work, control how the labor market works, which is another reason why I don't think we should have billionaires.
So we have millionaires.
Again, like we should we have millionaires?
Like, is there a limit for you when it comes to wealth?
I don't think that that's a question I can really answer because I wouldn't just kind of regulate it away. I wouldn't be like, oh, well, let's sign a law into existence that says billionaires can't exist anymore. Rather, I think the fact that we have billionaires is a reflection of an underlying imbalance of power in society that I don't think should exist. So I don't think there should be an imbalance of power between, the people who own all the stuff and the people who work for a living. Like, ultimately, if you gave everyone £1 million, there would be loads of millionaires, but it wouldn't mean anything because everyone would have £1 million, right? So I don't think it's really a question of like the level of cash, although it is worth pointing out there's a massive distinction between a millionaire and a billionaire. It's something like counting the numbers to 1 million would take you 12 days, while counting the numbers to 1 billion would take you 32 years. Like that is a lot of wealth. But yeah, it's not really about like the numbers or as kind of catchy and useful as it is to be able to say get rid of billionaires. It's more about the power.
Is there any systematic reason why there are more male billionaires than female billionaires?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we live in a kind of a patriarchal capitalist system as well, in which men are socialized to exhibit the virtues that are associated with like wealth creation, which is, you know, competition, competitiveness, ruthlessness, kind of lack of consideration for anything other than their own goals, whereas women are socialized to be nice, caring, sweet, whatever. Those distinctions are obviously being broken down as we kind of do start to challenge questions of patriarchy. And now you can find just as many Sheryl Sandbergs as you can find, well, not just as many, but like quite a lot of Sheryl Sandbergs alongside Jeff Bezos's. But I don't think that's really the main problem we should be worrying about. I don't think we should be trying to create an equal number of female and male billionaires. I think we should be getting rid of them.
Did you ever, like as a kid or something, dream of becoming rich and a billionaire?
Well, no, because I always, and again, this is like very easy for me to say because I've always had most of what I've wanted, right? I didn't grow up, like I kind of understand this attitude among people who like grow up in poverty and in like less well-off backgrounds that you want to be able to have enough to survive. So if you then set about organizing your life in such a way as to make yourself wealthy, that is understandable. I never really had that. But then again, you know, I know loads of people who I went to university with who will grow up way wealthier than me and all they want to do is make more money. A lot of them, again, are men. I just never really, it didn't, I think especially as well, like I saw around me and I still around me see lots of very, very rich people who are very, very unhappy. I have a great life. Like I get to kind of come to cool places. Like I get to have my own schedule. I get to like, you know, decide what I want to do every day. I have like freedom. And also I earn enough money to make that freedom mean something. I would never want to do anything that would require me to sacrifice that freedom for the sake of becoming richer.
So growing up, like you went to school, you were privately educated. Like at school, did you guys learn about what kind of system you're living in?
No.
What did you learn?
You know.
What did they tell you?
Maths, geography, English, whatever. I was very badly behaved at school though. I kept getting expelled from all of my schools. So I went to 3 schools between...
Really?
Yeah, 11 and...
What for?
18.
What were you expelled for?
Just like, I mean... You know,
Bad
there was
behavior?
like, yeah, there was, you know, specific incidents, but there was a general like.
These socialistic tendencies need to stop. She needs to get out.
There was that. It was just like, I don't know. I
Stalin needs to go.
I just distracted everyone all the time. I was like, I don't know why I was so badly behaved. I couldn't pay attention. I probably had ADHD or something, to be honest, but like I like was very focused on the things that I was interested in and everything else just seemed boring and meaningless. And so I'd always get sent out of my lessons. And then my granddad used to give me loads of books that were like about socialism and all these sorts of things. And I always used to get sent out of my lessons because I'd be distracting everyone. So I would just go sit outside and like read one of my books. It's like I did very well at school, but I just couldn't be in lessons.
But what was the narrative that UK schools, give to you guys, like about your country, about the economy?
I mean,
like,
obviously varies.
Do they call it capitalism? Do they like celebrate it?
Do they call it capitalism? I mean, it's difficult. I guess in like probably not. No, I don't think that there would be that many scenarios in which a teacher would use the word capitalism.
Like in Germany, we call it soziale Marktwirtschaft, social marketplace.
Right. Okay.
We don't say capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, I think that most capitalists, other than in America, where there's like a kind of certain amount of pride associated with the term, don't refer to themselves as capitalists.
Why is that?
Because it's not got brilliant connotations. It's something like 60% of millennials in the US have an unfavorable view of capitalism. When we think about capitalism, it's generally associated with greed, recklessness, like bad stuff. People don't call themselves, they generally call themselves liberals, right? Rather than calling themselves capitalists, which basically means I think that we should have political rights and the state should not do anything in the market. And again, that is just based on this completely vacuous and wrong distinction between states and markets. But I think that's how most, capitalists would describe themselves. But yeah, I mean, in the British school system, you wouldn't learn about what is socialism, really. I mean, obviously, I haven't been to school in a while, but I know that there have been some reforms recently that have been, really about making things, if anything, even less critical. We don't really, the worst thing about, I think, the English education system is you never learn about empire. Like in history, you learn about
the British Empire.
You never learn about British Empire. And this was the case certainly when I was at school. I don't know if it still is, but you would learn about the Tudors and the kings of England, and then you would learn about World War II, and then you would learn about the Russian Revolution, and that was it.
Are you a monarchist?
Republican.
So you want the queen gone?
It wouldn't be, my number one thing that I would do because she's very popular, but the monarchy seems to be making itself dramatically less popular with every passing year. So maybe they'll manage to get rid of themselves, but who knows?
So you were a good pupil. How did you know what to study when you went to university? Like, why did you become like a teacher or social worker?
I guess I was always very interested in politics. So I would always talk to my granddad about this sort of stuff. And I always kind of knew that I wanted to do something vaguely political. So it was actually when I was really young, I was like 13, and I was chatting to my dad about politics, and he was like, oh, why don't you look at PPE at Oxford? That could be something cool for you to look at. And it was at that age that I was like, this looks really cool. This is what I want to do. So I kind of then, from about the age of 13, was then focused on going to do this degree, which is quite mad. It's very weird, but yeah, I knew I wanted to do something in and around politics. And then when I got to Oxford, I was kind of like, oh, maybe I want to do something more international. I did my master's in African studies. I was like, maybe going to go, work for the UN or something like that.
Did you learn in African studies? Did you learn about the colonial stuff, empire?
Yeah.
Oh.
So that was really, I think, where I got most of my kind of critical education, funnily enough, was not doing my PPE degree, which was literally like my PPE degree. I basically spent like a whole term studying like Hume and Locke and like English empiricism.
Just for the audience, PPE means
politics, philosophy, and economics. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So I didn't get much critical exposure during that. But when I did African studies, it actually, I think, helped me to understand how global capitalism works more effectively than studying economics.
Why?
Because it allows you to see very clearly the ways in which value is extracted by rich countries from poor countries, and just to see the dynamics of global capitalism and of global production in a way that you don't get when you're kind of doing like very abstract economic theory. And yeah, I mean, I learned about colonialism. I learned about the role of the IMF and the World Bank in the 1980s debt crisis, structural adjustment, like all these different sorts of things. That was, I think, really how I first kind of came to learn about neoliberalism, was really about studying the 1980s debt crisis. So yeah, I think just the way that like the least powerful are treated in any system, whether that's the least powerful states in the world system, whether it's least powerful people in society, learning about how they're treated and the rules that they are forced to live by, I think gives you quite a good indication as to how that system works.
I mean, even before capitalism, there was colonialism. How did colonialism, British colonialism, German colonialism change with capitalism?
Well, I mean, colonialism of the kind pursued in, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, the UK.
France, Germany.
Yeah, France, yeah. To a lesser extent Germany, was really integral in the development of capitalism. Because you had, a kind of emerging mercantile trading class in these economies, particularly in the Netherlands and the UK. And they were able to kind of, travel around the world, open up new markets for exploration, provide English capitalists with access to raw materials and, to a lesser extent with the settler colonies with export markets. And if you look at things like, the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, these were models, I would say, for, this is controversial, but I would say for today's capitalist enterprises, because they were very much kind of joint ventures between business interests and the state. Mm-hmm. So like the British East India Company kind of governed India, right? Like on behalf of the crown. And Adam Smith was writing at the time, looking at this, this weird company and saying, this isn't how free markets should work. What is this thing, doing? Why does it have so much power? Whereas actually, from a Marxist perspective, looking at something like the East India Company, that is really arguably how most companies work. They have political power as well as economic power. And their relationships with the state are, if anything, more important in determining how successful they are than their underlying competitiveness. This is obviously the case in Germany, for example.
So after you graduated, you got your master's degree in African studies, you started to work as a management consultant.
I worked for KPMG for about 9 months. I didn't get on very well.
Tell us how you get to work there.
Yeah, so after university, I went to work as an intern at a think tank. I was 6 months as an intern in London, being paid like £5 an hour or something, which was quite funny. But that was like a good starting role, really. Like it's obviously quite difficult to get into this world coming out of university. And then we had been doing some work with KPMG on like local government, basically.
Like tell the audience what KPMG is.
Oh, so it's like a big accountancy firm. Mm-hmm. I worked in their consulting arm. And again, this kind of... these big accounting organizations that also have management consulting arms are very controversial because there's often lots of conflicts of interest there that have led to lots of, like the Enron scandal, for example, but that's a story for another day. So I worked there doing basically public sector consulting. And when I started, they were setting up a kind of local government consulting practice. So a lot of the work we were doing was like... pro bono or very cheap. So we would work with like councillors and, like mayors and local leaders to help them set up different things, like help them, manage their public services or whatever. But it didn't take long before I was like, I'm terrible at working within a big organization because I'm not very good at being told what to do and like, taking orders or whatever. And B, that I just found the whole thing, I don't know, there was a point at which we got told you need to make sure that any work you're selling, we're getting X% margins on. And when I heard that, I was like, well, that's just money that's coming out of the taxpayers' pockets and going into, partners' pockets. So it literally took like 9 months for me to be like, this isn't for me. And I left and went to another think tank, which was, kind of developing policy. And I stayed there for, I think, like 2 years. And then after that, I left to write my book.
What was the original plan after college? Like, what did you want to become?
What was my plan?
I mean,
you're
an author now, columnist, journalist.
What did I want to become? I don't really think I knew, to be honest. Like, I just knew that there were things that I cared about and I wanted to learn more about those things and think about those things and talk about those things. Mm-hmm. So I never really had like I want to be this, like I want to be an MP or I want to be a journalist or I want to be a whatever.
Do you want to become an MP?
No, not really.
No,
I'm very happy with my life the way it is, to be honest. Like I guess I didn't follow a career trajectory. I followed the things I was interested in. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky to be able to do that. That's kind of really how I ended up here. And obviously like part of the reason that it got easier for me was that I was very involved in like the Corbyn movement when it kind of started. Mm-hmm. And that like gave me lots of links into politics at a time when, this like fledgling movement was looking for new people and when the media was looking for people who could speak on behalf of this movement. And that was a big part of how I kind of got into the spotlight was like I would go on TV and talk about why Labour's policy to nationalise the railways was actually a good thing at a time when it was quite difficult to find people who would do that.
If you have any questions for Grace, let us know in the live chat. Hans is gonna ask them at the end of the show. When was the first time you were on TV? Like, were you nervous?
The first time I was on TV was when I was 11 and I won a Christmas card competition. I had designed a Christmas card and I submitted it to my local my local TV station, and I won the competition and they interviewed me on TV and I was really happy about it. After that, the probably the first real time I was on TV as an adult was when I went to work for this think tank in Manchester, IBPR North, and it was just after Article 50 had been issued, had been invoked.
What was that?
That would have been 2017, I think.
And what's Article 50?
Oh, sorry, it was about Brexit.
Oh, Brexit.
Yeah.
So before Brexit, you were never on TV? You were not a public person?
No. Yeah, I mean, I think the first time I went on TV, it must have been 23 or 24. Yeah, 2016 or 2017, I can't remember which one.
I mean, as a columnist, you yourself wrote about Lexit, the left version of leaving the European Union. Did you support the Brexit campaign?
Well, I didn't actually vote to leave the European Union. I've always been very, very skeptical of the EU. And this is partly something that actually comes from my granddad and from his political hero, Tony Benn, who always referred to the European Union as a kind of neoliberal club. So I was always very skeptical of it. But I didn't end up voting to leave. I didn't campaign actively in the election because I didn't think that I could really put my heart and soul into campaigning to stay in the EU. But I also didn't want to put a tick next to a box by a campaign that was basically run by like Nigel Farage that was really a kind of,
So you voted for Remain?
I voted to Remain.
Did you? Do you regret not campaigning
for Leave?
For Remain?
No, I don't, because
I mean, it ended up you guys leaving the European Union now.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously we're leaving the European Union in a way that is dictated by the Conservative Party, which makes it an inherently reactionary enterprise. But like the reason that I started writing about Lexit was because I had all these issues with the way that the European Union worked anyway. And I was very intimately aware that if the Labour Party said, we are going to reverse this decision, bear in mind that all of my analysis is basically like around the anger that people rightly and justifiably feel about the fact that they don't have any control over any of the decisions that affect their lives, whether that's in the workplace, in the state, in public services, whatever. Like coming back and saying, oh, we're going to just overturn this result, rather than figuring out a way of honoring it that was going to be progressive, or at least kind of that was not going to damage the British economy and potentially create some other opportunities. That's what I thought we should have done. I think we should have said, we respect the result of this referendum. Let's figure out a way of making sure that the way that we leave the European Union is progressive.
But did you not care how the result of the referendum was?
Yeah, I remember on the day, because I never thought that Leave would win either. Like I wasn't any more clued in on that than anyone else.
But the result of the referendum resulted through manipulation, social media bullshit.
Yeah, it did. And also there are a lot of people who wanted to leave.
They cheated.
Yes, but like we will never know the extent to which that was like, indicative of what happened. What we do know is that there is a large portion of the population.
But it was very close, and I'm just wondering how you can accept the result then. I mean, it wasn't that there was quite a there was not a big margin, but there was certainly a fairly significant margin of the kind that it would be difficult to ascribe purely to electoral manipulation. Yeah, I kind of don't buy this whole thing that if we hadn't had Cambridge Analytica, then like none of this stuff would have happened. It kind of is a way of comforting yourself that actually we don't live in a society in which people want these things to happen, which makes sense if you're like someone who lives in London and has never met anyone who like genuinely wants to leave the European Union. You'd probably be like, how did this happen? None of my friends want to leave the EU. It must have been, like data manipulation or whatever. But there are a lot of people for different reasons. So I think that, the Brexit vote was really divided into two sets of people, one of which was like older, wealthy homeowners who were just like brought into this Tory line of like, we need British sovereignty and all those sorts of things, and who didn't really have
much at stake in the
Take
sense
the
that
power
they're-
back.
Yeah, well, exactly. For the people that they liked. And they didn't really have much at stake materially because they were already relatively wealthy and they could afford to kind of have this politics of cultural reaction. And then there was like another group of people who are, you know, often kind of like working class, generally also older, like traditionally working class voters, who, again, older often, although some young people as well, some of whom were probably, and a lot of these like older rich people were also like, we want to get all the immigrants out because, you know, well, yeah, because they're inherently nationalistic and have that sort of that reactionary politics. And then, you know, there were lots of working class voters, some of whom were, again, voting for this on the basis of we need to get the immigrants out because they're taking our public services and, you know, reducing our wages. And I think part of the reason that narrative was compelling was because there had been no one who had really provided any decent explanation as to why you had a decade of wage stagnation in the UK, or, you know, public services had been eviscerated, or basically why living standards hadn't increased in a long time. So it was easy for people to say, well, it's obviously the fault of immigrants, and that was reinforced by the media. So that, you know, creates quite fertile conditions for that kind of argument. And then there also were a section of people who were like, I don't, you know, think that the EU is a good progressive institution. I think it is centralizing political power, and I want political power to be as close to the people as possible. So there were like so many different factors going into this vote. It's very difficult to look at it and just say it was just this or it was just that. And that was really my argument, is that Brexit is a process, and as a historical event, its meaning is not predetermined. The meaning of Brexit is and was always going to be determined by the way that it happened, the way that the process played out, and who was shaping that process. And my argument was, if Labour tries to overturn this result, rather than trying to bring together people on different sides of the divide and uniting them into a broader coalition, saying, right, well, if you really want to take back control, let's take back control from the kind of powerful elites who've governed this country for such a long time. If Labour didn't do that and just kind of fell into the Brexit culture war, it would lose. And it did. That's exactly what happened. And when it lost, obviously that means the Conservatives get in. It means Brexit happens in the most violent and reactionary way possible. And you get the worst of all worlds. So in many ways, all these arguments about how, you know, whether or not we should respect the referendum was what I thought were academic. Because if Labour did say we're going for a second referendum, it was always going to be destroyed. And it wouldn't matter, like, you know, how reactionary you think the Conservatives are and how inherently bad you think Brexit is, because you have no power to shape the way that it is going to happen.
Did British capitalists support Brexit?
There was, again, a divide there. And I think the divide was broadly, I mean, it's a kind of divide that you often see within capital. It was a divide between interests that primarily undertook production and generated profit domestically and through kind of, production, versus
Like who?
manufacturing companies, retail, some hospitality, kind of, you know, those kinds of more domestic facing enterprises, small businesses, for example, they were quite anti it. And also some of the big banks, the big investment banks, because obviously a lot of their business is governed by kind of EU frameworks and they need to be able to operate across the bloc. And then there was a group of more internationally focused capitalists, and also what we would call rentiers. So people in rentiers, so rentier capital, which is kind of, hedge funds, people in property, relatively kind of extractive sections of the economy that depend upon state regulation. And where, for them, the vision of leaving the European Union was to slash regulation governing their sectors of the economy, right? And the Conservatives obviously never really led with that ideal for Brexit, but that set of priorities is certainly something that motivated a lot of free market libertarian conservative thinkers, and also a lot of pretty extractive interests within British capitalism as well.
Do you ever see Great Britain or the UK return to the European Union?
I mean,
I'm sure that's what a lot of our viewers are worrying about.
yeah, I can imagine. I don't think so. And
We
I
want
think,
you back, guys.
Well, I think the European Union has its own problems to deal with before thinking about reintegrating
We're going to talk about
the
that
UK
in a
or
minute.
expanding even more. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I question whether or not the European project will exist in its current form in several decades. Because as it stands, the Eurozone is not fit for purpose. I cannot see how, without pretty foundational and transformational political change, the Eurozone survives in its current form.
Why?
Because it is creating dynamics that are generating...
It's working for us.
Reinforcing massive inequalities between different parts of the Eurozone. So inequality between North and South has obviously been getting worse for a while and is continuing to get worse. And that will not change unless the structure of the Eurozone is completely and utterly transformed. Obviously, the thing that we have at the moment is that Germany in particular and some other Northern European countries have been repressing wages and refusing to invest for a very long time, which makes your exports look extremely competitive because, you know, you're productive but don't have to pay your workers very much. And that relative competitiveness relative to the Southern European economies, which are less industrialized, less advanced, is reinforced by the single currency, which makes German exports seem more competitive because for you, the euro is less valuable than what your currency would be if you had your own currency. Whereas for those in the South, it makes their exports seem less competitive and imports seem more competitive. And as a result of that, you get a kind of decimation of export markets and also capital being sucked into things like real estate, for example, in Spain, which was a big part of what why the crisis was so bad there. And the only strategy to deal with that within the current Eurozone framework is to force through the same kind of deflationary measures that are adopted voluntarily in Germany onto Greek, Spanish, European workers. Austerity, yeah, basically wage repression. The other way of doing this would be a kind of more Keynesian approach, which would be to say, right, well, you know, these places are basically starved of investment. Germany is also starving itself of investment, by the way. You know, the fact that basically Germany is able to run this constant budget surplus and constant current account surplus is premised upon the way that this block is structured at the moment. So the fact that Germany constantly has a current account surplus and has a budget surplus is basically because Germany, Greece, Spain, wherever else have a current account deficit and have budget deficits, right? The only way to equalize that out in a sustainable way would be to invest. So to have the Northern European countries, which benefit so much from this setup, invest in updating infrastructure, technology, all the things that are required to make these exporting countries more competitive, boosting productivity and allowing them to achieve high rates of growth over the long run, and also ultimately by mutualizing the debt of these countries. And that's not going to happen because even the kind of ECB's quantitative easing program, which wasn't debt mutualization, but was a step towards debt mutualization, was, as we were discussing yesterday, held up in German courts because debt mutualization is not allowed within the European Union, within the Eurozone as it exists today. So without all of those things changing, which they're not going to change because the way that the system works now works extremely well for Germany, and Germany basically decides what happens along with these other, you know, fiscally conservative Northern European countries, they're not going to budge.
Well, if you call for more investment in the Eurozone, you know, more public spending, that means we got to go into debt. And debt is bad.
Okay, so
debt is bad. Schulden sind schlecht.
Debt is bad. Interesting. I mean, what is debt?
That's the German mindset.
What is debt? I mean, debt is basically kind of borrowing from the future, right? You are leveraging future income
exactly
in
on,
order
on
to
the back of our children
in order to pay for things today, right? The alternative to having no debt is to limit everything that we are able to do based on the kind of stock of savings that we have in the economy today. And what that means is you are less able to undertake investments that create better conditions for production over the long term. I mean, the thing about debt, the thing about, for example, taking out a mortgage, we don't think taking out a mortgage is bad. Like if you're in the UK, to be able to get access to a mortgage is something that like the vast majority of people would love to have, because you are taking out debt, sure, but you're acquiring an asset. You're acquiring this thing that is very, very valuable and will make you very, very rich over the long term. Big corporations love being able to access loads of debt. Why? Because they're able often to use that debt to buy other corporations or to invest in new assets or invest in production that makes them wealthier and more powerful over the long run. In the same way, as a state, as the public sector, if you decide we are going to borrow money to make ourselves wealthier over the long run, that is going to be a much more productive way of organizing your economy than just saying we are not going to do any investment. We are going to sit traveling around on infrastructure that's existed since the 1960s, not invest in technology, not invest in decarbonization.
Welcome to Germany.
I was literally about to say, which is what Germany has been doing for a long time. Then you are basically stuck constantly in the conditions that exist today. You're never able to kind of reshape the way that your society, your economy works. So, debt is not an inherently good or inherently bad thing, right? It is a tool that can be used for good, i.e. if, you are a public sector and you invest in decarbonization, for example, using debt, or it can be used for bad. Like if you are a massive monopoly and you have a relationship with a powerful investment bank and that investment bank gives you a massive loan to be able to buy up loads of other corporations so that you can corner the market. Debt is something that is, is a tool, and it depends on how you use it.
I mean, most people don't study economics. They probably don't even can quite follow you what you mean.
I'm sorry. I also speak quite quickly. So
yeah, that's...
You can read my book if you want more information.
But like for people who are not like academics, like who've been living in Germany all their lives, who have this German mindset of debt is bad, can you make an argument for people that's easy to understand that investment is very much needed right now?
Yeah, so I did this. There was a clip I did, one of my first TV appearances that went viral because someone was basically saying to me like, making this argument, we can't possibly take out debt because it will harm our children, and a household has to balance its budget, and a household can't carry on going into debt forever and ever and ever. And I was like, right, okay, well, let's take that analogy. You are the head of a household. You've lost your job. As in, let's say we were thinking about the period after the financial crisis. So your income is much lower because the economy is in recession or you have lost your job. And you don't really have any prospects. You're not really sure what you're going to do with your future. You're kind of barely able to really make ends meet and survive. You have two options. One of them is to sell your house, stop buying food, and hopefully being able to repay your debts that way. Ultimately, of course, you're then on the street and your kids might die, but at least you don't have any debt anymore. Woo. The other way is to say, well, maybe I will take out a loan to go to university, and maybe I will use that loan to be able to pay for my studies and to pay for my rent over the short term, and that will give me a degree, which I will then be able to use to go into the labour market and get a good job that allows me to pay off my debt over the long run. That is, of course, what most economies did after the Second World War. The UK, for example, had a massive amount of debt, huge amount of debt after the Second World War because it had to borrow lots of money to fight the war. It didn't then say, right, we're going to stop spending. It spent more. We built the NHS. We built huge stocks of social housing. We built out public services. And what happened then? The economy grew. And because the economy grew, tax revenues increased and public spending had to be less high than it otherwise would have been. And then the debt declined as a percentage of GDP. So these are your two options, basically. Austerity, no house, you're on the street, you can't afford to pay for your kids, or shock horror, take out a little bit more debt, invest in yourself, invest in your country or economy, and then you grow your way out of that debt over the long term.
I think it's still too difficult for people.
Okay, so you own a business, your creditor's knocking on the door saying, let's say you own a bar, your creditor's knocking on the door saying, you've got too much debt, pay me back, over the next few months. Either you sell all of your bar stalls, sell all of your stock, sell the property that you're using and use all that money to pay off your debts, which means you don't have a business anymore and you're on the street. Or you take out a little bit more debt, invest in your business, let's say, buy some new chairs, hire a member of staff, which means that you can be open much longer. Your revenue increases, invest in advertising, your revenue increases, and you pay the debt back over the long run. Is that simple enough?
Yeah. But why do you make the private businessman example? Because we're talking about public debt.
Well, because it's a similar principle. The principle is, do you sell everything to pay back debt so that you have no debt? Or do you take out a little bit more debt to allow yourself to make more money to pay off that debt over the long run? So either, you do what like the UK did, you privatize everything, you sell off the family silver, sell off British Rail, British Airways, whatever, and you say, right, okay, that's great. Sell off public housing. That's great. We don't have any debt anymore. But ultimately, you have a shriveled and unproductive and austere public sphere where people are living in poverty because you haven't got any social housing available to them anymore. So they're paying 40% of their rents to be in the private sector. And you have a load of privatized companies that mean that, getting from London to Manchester on our privatized rail network can cost you upwards of like £100. Or you invest in improving that rail infrastructure in such a way that means that, it's cheaper for workers to get to work, so they have more money left over to spend in the economy, so businesses grow more, so they pay more taxes, so the debt reduces as a size of GDP over the long run.
Is there a limit for public debt?
Yeah, so, and this is again... this is a complicated question in terms of like economics. A big part of the justification of the austerity agenda was that there was a paper that was done that said that if the debt to GDP ratio goes above 90%, then economic growth falls off a cliff. It later emerged that the way that those economists had calculated that figure was wrong. They had an error in their spreadsheet, which made it look like that was the case, but it actually wasn't.
Excel error.
There isn't like a hard and fast number for this. It is all really about, it's what you're using the debt for, and the conditions that you're creating for the future. So like, for example, taking on loads of debt to bail out the banks was a really bad idea. It was a really bad, obviously, the banks, we needed to do something to prevent the whole economy from going into financial meltdown. But bailing out the banks and then basically kind of not requiring anything of them, not saying you have to invest in order to boost economic growth, just giving these bankers like a carte blanche to have control over the public purse, that increased the national debt a lot, but it didn't give us anything. It didn't change anything. It just meant, the public debt went up and the bankers walked away with billions of pounds. That was a very bad use of debt. A good use of debt would be having a bond issuance that would, be used by the government to build solar panels or like wind turbines, or to decarbonize the transport system, or to build social housing, or to retrofit existing housing to make it more sustainable, because that is creating value over the long run.
In your example, you also said, you can take out more debt to grow out of your debt. Isn't that reinforcing the capitalistic mantra of growth?
Yeah. So again, when I'm stating all of this stuff, it is very much within the logic of a capitalist economy, right?
Exactly.
This is basically just...
Which you want to overcome.
Well, yeah, exactly, because this is basically just Keynesianism, right? But what we were talking about, bear this in mind, was why the European Union is completely unsustainable.
Okay.
So a Keynesian approach to the Eurozone, to like allocating capital within the Eurozone, would make the European Union more sustainable. It might not necessarily, it would probably make it a bit fairer, but it wouldn't make it a socialist utopia. My argument would be, if we're going to do something along the lines of a Green New Deal, for example, it's not enough just to borrow to pump money into the economy, because ultimately the heads of big businesses are going to be scooping a certain amount off the top. We also need to think about nationalizing things, taking things into democratic public control. So, for example, in the UK, having public control over the railways, public control over utilities, over broadband, all these sorts of things. They're actually quite popular with the public. I would also argue we need a public financial system, as I've spoken about already. And that would mean that then the investment that you do, you're recouping. It's not just being, skimmed off the top and going to shareholders. It actually comes back into the public sector.
So you called the European Union neoliberal. You once called them, or many times, neo-colonial.
Yeah.
And that the European Union is run in the interest of financial and corporate elites. Why is that? How's the European Union neo-colonial?
Okay, so let's take, for example, something like the Common Agricultural Policy, right? Which has been reformed in recent years, but not nearly enough. This is a set of basically subsidies that allow agricultural businesses, mostly, to have kind of higher prices for the things that they're producing, backed up by the European Union, and which make it much harder for farmers in the global south who are selling the same sorts of things to be able to compete on world markets. It's basically rich countries giving themselves a subsidy whilst most of the rest of the world isn't able to do the same thing. You also have just like the architecture of the treaties that are written between the EU, the trade treaties that are written between the EU and lots of other parts of the world are often very, very unfair, particularly when it comes to things like taxation. Some of them will also have these things called, what they call trade and investment, what am I talking about? They will also have these things called, this thing has completely gone off the top of my head. I was thinking of TTIP, but it's not that. In TTIP, you had these things that are investor-state dispute settlements, ISDSs, that allow private companies to sue governments if they introduce legislation that harms their profits.
And private courts.
Yeah, and private courts, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the kind of architecture that governs trade and investment within and outside of the European Union is neocolonial. It's also, so as part of a lot of these treaties, obviously within the European Union, you have complete freedom of capital mobility. And capital account liberalization is also often a condition of making a trade treaty with the European Union, which means you can't have any barriers to capital flows between the country that you're in and the EU and the rest of the world. And that often disadvantages countries in the global south because it makes them more... it basically often you see capital being sucked out of those countries. So sub-Saharan Africa loses 3 times more each year than in capital flight than it gains in development aid. And a lot of that has to do with these treaties that force these countries to completely open up financial markets, which basically allow elites to siphon money off into, tax havens, as well as, savings to flow out of that economy into the rest of the world. That kind of basically reinforces the dynamics of value extraction within the capitalist world system that are imperialistic.
Why is the EU run in the interest of financial and corporate elites?
Well, all you really have to do is look at the huge amount of money that is spent by private corporations and organizations on lobbying, and then the successes that many of those lobbyists have had in influencing the way that policy is developed at the level of the European Union. A really good example of this is the emissions trading scheme, which was introduced as a way to kind of try and reduce carbon emissions, but ultimately the price at which these carbon credits were issued, the whole architecture was basically influenced dramatically by the fossil fuel companies. So the fossil fuel companies ended up lobbying for the creation of a system that allowed many polluters to actually make money through the carbon trading scheme, through the emissions trading scheme, rather than, kind of being fined or facing costs for being polluters. So that whole architecture of that system failed because of the lobbying power of a few very big, powerful corporations. And you see this happen again and again and again.
So, like for Germany and Germans, it's unthinkable to leave the European Union for many reasons. But many would still agree with you that the things you say about the European Union are true. How can Germans or Germany as like the biggest and most powerful player in the European Union, how can we change the European Union to not have it that it's not neoliberal anymore, that it's not neo-colonial anymore, how that the European Union is not run in the interests of financial and corporate elites?
So I think all of those issues are really around, they center on questions of who has power.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the problems with the way the European Union works have to do with the fact that it is just not nearly democratic enough. So the decision-making process obviously centers around the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. And of those three, only the Parliament really is democratic, unless you think that, you know, heads of states making decisions about things is democracy in any real sense of the word, which I don't.
Well, I mean, the heads of states were democratically,
of course, and that's what everyone says. But like,
elected in their countries.
It's a lot of steps in between, like, you know, being able to hold someone to account.
But like the Commission president right now, Ursula von der Leyen, she didn't even run in the last European election, and then she was just like, okay, there she is.
It's not a democratic system, I think, in any real sense of the word. And then you have all of these other sets of institutions like the ECB, for example, which has absolutely zero democratic accountability whatsoever. So, you know, the only real way to counter the power of these kind of vested interests over the development of policy at the level of the European Union is to change the way that decisions are made. So, you know, a lot of people would just say, right, well, we need to change policy. We need to just like transform the Eurozone to make it more focused on investment. And that is true, but it's not going to happen as long as the politics of the European Union work in the way that they do. Unless we have a democratic European Union, i.e. one in which the voices of European citizens are what determine how decisions are made through a democratic process.
How do we get a democratic European Union?
Well, I mean, you could actually just say,
we are voting.
Get rid of the council, get rid of the commission, just have the European Parliament, and the decisions of the European Parliament work as any other legislative body would. And, you know, as well as that, doing other things like democratizing the European Central Bank, democratizing, you know, the plethora of other institutions that exist around it. Just say, you know, the decisions that are made are going to be made through an electoral process rather than by executive fiat.
Is the the EU Charter neoliberal in itself?
I don't think I know enough about the specific nature of the European Charter to be able to say whether or not it's neoliberal in itself. But certainly things like that are central to the bloc, like, you know, this question of capital mobility, the fact that you are always going to have complete and utter free movement of capital within this system. That kind of institutionalizes neoliberalism because it makes it much harder to be able to like properly regulate the financial sector.
And I was wondering, like, why did the UK join the European Union in the first place? I mean, why did Thatcher?
Because Thatcher changed her mind.
Why did she change her mind?
Well, I think because for a few reasons. I mean, I think it became obvious that the benefits to British business and finance in terms of trade and investment would be fairly significant and would be significant enough to balance any potential loss of sovereignty. And also, of course, because Thatcher was able to negotiate a load of opt-out and exemptions and like special treatment for the UK, basically, that meant that it was able to join the EU, but it didn't have to sign up to kind of ever closer union. It wasn't going to have to sign up to the single currency. Like it had its, you know, big rebate, all these sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, basically there was a decision that, you know, being in the EU was going to benefit British capital more than being out of it, basically.
When did you learn that you're able to write and publicly speak well? Like, did people tell you, like, Grace, you need to be on TV, you need to be a writer?
I don't remember.
You do have a talent for it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm trying to think. I mean,
there were, I don't know, a lot of 28-year-old German women who are as well spoken.
That's very kind.
When it comes to talking about capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I don't really know when I knew that I was kind of...
Yeah, you have like an anti-capitalist public speaking school in the UK that we should know about?
No. I mean, partly, of course, like I'm just lucky because I grew up in an environment where this sort of stuff was encouraged, and I just, became very confident. I think often like a thing that you get from private education is the confidence to stand up and kind of say the things that you believe. And I was lucky to have that. I was like lucky in a lot of ways. Like the way I speak, the way I act means that I'm more likely to be accepted into media institutions and is more palatable to the people who are making decisions. So like that makes it a lot easier for me. But I also had a lot of help. So like there is no anti-capitalist media school in the UK, but there is a great organization called the New Economic Organisers Network that I applied to back in 2016, and that I did some media training with them. So they basically kind of ran a weekend long, a few day long program that trained you in how to be in the media. And then they go out and they find you bookings to go out into the media. And the spokesperson network run by Neon continues to exist. And it's how a lot of people who are big in the media have managed to get into that. I obviously also, like a big part of the reason that I was brought on TV was because of Corbynism, because I was involved in that political movement. That political movement was big and people wanted to hear someone to talk about it. So
it's dead now.
Well, yeah, kind of. Socialism isn't dead, but that particular era is dead. But there is a legacy, there is an institutional legacy, and there is a legacy of people who, like me, became like public figures during that time who still exist, and also people who started organizing at the grassroots level, building up campaigns, who are still doing that sort of stuff to this day as well. So there is a legacy.
Tell us more about this weekend workshop. Like,
this is great. And I mean, like,
what was the training about?
It was all about, so it was inherently progressive. So it was about training progressive voices to go out into the media, basically on the assumption that like the UK media is really biased towards the right. So that already sets it apart somewhat. And the training was basically about how you develop your message. So, you're someone who works at a think tank, let's say. You have these really clever ideas about policy, but you're talking about them in such a way that no one's ever really going to understand you. The training was like, right, how do you take these ideas and translate them into bite-sized, digestible lines and narratives that you're going to be able to put forward when you go on the media? How do you deal with difficult interviews? How do you shape a political message? All these sorts of things they did in the training. And it was super, super helpful. And also, I mean, I think the main thing that it did again was like, when you have that team behind you and you go out into the media, you're more confident. And once you've done it a few times, you become confident enough to be able to do it off the top of a hat, basically. So, yeah, it was good. You guys should get one in Germany.
Maybe there is one.
Maybe there is one. I don't know. But
maybe Hans will tell us. You should meet Hans. Like, he was a student leader in the 68 movement. But he'll come later. Let's talk about capitalism itself. How did you learn? Like, did you learn at college, at university, how capitalism started? Like, when did it start?
When did capitalism start? I mean,
And did capitalism ever work for the many?
So I think, firstly, this question of how capitalism started is very important because the foundational act in many ways to kind of create capitalist economies was an act of dispossession. And it was what Marx called primitive accumulation. Basically, to have a class-based society in which some people have to sell their labor power for a living, to be able to, so that the capitalists could kind of, use that labor power in the production process, you have to create a landless class of workers who have to sell their labor power for a living. Because throughout most of human history, working for a wage is not something that most people have done. They have, either like broadly existed in subsistence agriculture or maybe been in like small craft or, trade or whatever. Wage work has not been the normal thing that most people would do. So to change that, people had to be dispossessed from their land. Like
from many people, like, what did they do before wages?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was like subsistence agriculture. It was like craft work, not good stuff. And I'll come on to this in a second. But the first act of to establish a capitalist economy was an act of dispossession. which in the UK were the enclosures. So prior to the enclosures, there existed a lot of common land in the UK that could be used to kind of by like peasants to basically like, you know, have their animals, and that would allow them to, you know, maybe have products to sell or have products to eat or whatever. And it was like land that was held in common and it could be used by everyone, basically. The enclosures, based on the myth of the tragedy of the commons. So the myth of the tragedy of the commons was that this common land was being degraded because there wasn't a price for the land. There wasn't a rent on the land. So everyone was using it too much. So this was used as a justification to parcel off and privatize that common land. And what that meant was that peasants who had previously been able to survive without selling their labor power for a wage were no longer able to survive without selling their labor power for a wage. It meant that a lot of those people then had to move to big cities, and they had to move to those big cities, and they had to then work in the factories that were the kind of foundations of British capitalism. And that early period of British capitalism.
But did the crown sell it to rich people? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't exactly know who ended up being the main beneficiaries of this, but it was basically like it ended up benefiting the kind of landed elites predominantly.
And when was that?
That was, oh God.
1800,
17.
17.
I don't actually know. I should know that. 1700s, I think. God, this is embarrassing. My historical knowledge is absolutely appalling. But yeah, it was at some point before the 1800s, basically. Because that's really when you start to see like the proper scaling up of British capitalism.
Okay.
And yeah, so that then creates the conditions for industrialization that happens in the UK from, the kind of 1800s onwards. And that early period of industrialization, which Marx actually writes about, he studies England in the first volume of Capital, and he has these amazing long sections where he looks at the conditions for the average factory worker in the UK. And he goes through all these texts that have been written by the British Parliament studying the lives of workers in these factories. And it's honestly just like astonishing the conditions that he shows that these workers live in, just like utterly appalling conditions. People would die extraordinarily early. And in many ways, this was, in terms of living standards, in terms of, just quality of life, a step back for many people from being subsistence farmers, which is saying something, because being a subsistence farmer is a pretty miserable life. So the act of, dispossessing these people creates this class of workers who can be exploited and oppressed pretty viciously in order to get British capitalism off the ground. Now, the second part of your question, which is like, okay, well, what were they doing before? A lot of people think, right, well, if you don't like capitalism, then obviously you want everyone to go back to feudalism. Before capitalism, everyone was just working on the land, and there was no medical care, and we were very poor. That is not what Marx says. Marx's theory is actually that this transition from feudalism to capitalism was a kind of inevitable transition, or maybe not inevitable in the exact way that it happened, but certainly politically, like that was always going to happen. And that the development of capitalism creates the conditions within which we're able to build a socialist society. So you could never go from feudalism to socialism. Capitalism creates this extraordinary amount of wealth, and it in many ways creates the kinds of socialized production that you would need in a socialist economy. So like the fact that you start to get, big factories and a huge amount of investment in infrastructure, technological investment that is done in the interests of profit. This creates the conditions that are needed to, have an economy in which these resources are collectivized and are run in common.
So socialists should actually be thankful for capitalism.
Yeah.
Because without capitalism, there wouldn't be
socialism. Huh. Exactly. This is Marx's argument, which is often mischaracterized, right? Marx sees that human society has to progress through this brutal, exploitative and extractive phase of capitalism in order to reach a point at which we could start implementing socialism. So it is, a view of human history that is based on this idea of kind of progress, I suppose, which some people dispute. But yeah, he certainly didn't think that like we never have had capitalism in the first place.
I also asked, did capitalism ever work for the many?
Did capitalism ever work for the many? I mean, no, because the whole foundation of capitalism is this divide between the many and the few.
The people who own the stuff
and the people who work
people
for
who
a living.
work for those
exactly.
people.
There was a period, and this is kind of Thomas Piketty's argument, which there was a period in the wake of the Second World War where managed capitalism or kind of organized capitalism of the kind that we had in the US, the UK, and much of Europe meant that it was much less unequal than it has been historically. But it is always important to bear in mind that, yes, living standards have been rising and inequality has been falling in the rich world for quite some time. But that is often premised upon the hyper-exploitation and oppression of people in the global south. So a lot of the reason that, for example, we had massive increase in living standards in the UK was because we were able to transition towards a professional and service-based economy, which was based on kind of finance and the management of a production process that was taking place elsewhere. That production process that was taking place elsewhere was, you know, workers throwing themselves off the roofs of Foxconn factories in China because they were so oppressed and exploited and, you know, paid barely enough to survive, or, you know, children picking coltan out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Like, the commodities that we imported in the transition towards a service-based economy were produced in pretty horrific conditions in other parts of the world. So it's always important to make sure you're viewing this thing, capitalism, at a global level. Because it would be easy to say, well, I mean, obviously over the last kind of 50 years, the middle class in the rich world has expanded dramatically, and that's been great for them. And, you know, there's less inequality now than there was in the past. But actually, you're not thinking about how that's playing out on the world scale. And that wealth in the rich world has come at the expense of exploitation in the rest of the world.
So you mentioned Marx a few times, great German thinker. I mean, even 150 years ago, he wrote about the contradictions of capitalism. Are these contradictions still true today? What are they? And are there new contradictions now?
Yeah, so actually, obviously the big thing, I guess, that we could talk about to begin with is the kind of ecological dimension of capitalism. And Marx was actually very prescient on this. He kind of realized that man's relationship with the earth was critical to how capitalist social relations work. He basically was like, the reason that capitalism can work is because lots of resources are given to us by nature as like a free gift. And the labor process kind of through which is the mechanism through which we transform nature's free gifts into things that we can use. So he was like, you know, capitalism is premised upon the exploitation of nature and the transformation of nature in such a way that cannot be sustainable over the long term. And there's some great thinkers. I interviewed a guy called Jason Moore actually on my podcast who writes about Marx's thinking on ecology. And it's really, really very interesting stuff, actually. So he was quite prescient in realizing that the capitalist social relations would make demands on nature that were unsustainable. And that would be something, a kind of limit against which capitalist production would come eventually. Although obviously it would have been difficult to tell that it would be happen in the way that it did at that time. So that's one contradiction. I mean, the other big set of contradictions all have to do with the contradictions of existing in a class-based system. So the classic one that everyone thinks about is, you know, capitalism will fail because there is this thing called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And that has to do with the fact that capitalists start substituting workers for machinery in the labor process, and because the profits of capital come from the exploitation of labor, that ultimately erodes profits within the system over the long run. That is controversial. Some people see it in a very kind of mechanistic way, in a very economistic way. Some people see it more as a question of kind of social relations, so of the relations between labor and capital primarily. And there are also very different readings as to whether or not this has been true over the course of the history of capitalism. If you look, for example, at something like the long-term interest rate, which is supposed to really reflect, in some sense, profitability, there has been a very long-term decline in interest rates in capitalist economies over, you know, several hundred years, which would imply that there might be some truth to this. But there have obviously been periods, particularly like, say, the run up to the financial crisis, when profits were extraordinarily high. Now, obviously, you can say, well, that was because that was unsustainable. And there's also a difference between saying the massive profits versus the rate of profits. I personally don't really like getting too caught up in this debate because it's a bit boring and it's a bit arcane. And, you know, even if there is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, ultimately we'll get to the point where capitalist production becomes unsustainable because of ecological constraints before we get to this point of capitalism becoming unsustainable because of these questions there. But there is a point in there, particularly around like the automation of production, which Marx says rightly kind of constantly continues and constantly increases throughout the course of the history of capitalism. And the way in which that undermines the kind of social relations that capitalism requires to reproduce itself. Because obviously, if all production is automated and is undertaken by a small number of people who own all the stuff and no longer need to hire workers to work in their factories, you have this problem of kind of, you know, constant increases in unemployment. And this is something that is actually looking as though it is coming true. The International Labour Organization has done some research showing that we are not creating enough jobs to account for the increase in the global population. It predominantly affects people in the global south, and it predominantly affects them because of less the mechanization of production, more the mechanization of agriculture, which has been a massive revolution that's taken place, you know, over the last kind of 50, 60 years, really. But yeah, these questions around automation and mechanization and the way that they kind of threaten the foundations of capitalism, Marx looked at those contradictions as well. He also looked at the business cycle. So the fact that over the course of the business cycle, individual firms tend to continuously increase investment and continuously kind of expand production in such a way as to like undermine the foundations of their own profitability, and ultimately they produce too much, they invest too much, and there are not the markets to be able to absorb all of the stuff that is produced, which is when you start to get financial crises or economic crises. And when those economic crises come, a lot of that value is destroyed, and then the process can start all over again. So he had quite a good analysis of the capitalist business cycle. And actually, the guy who is often credited with coming up with the whole idea of the business cycle, well, not the idea, but who came up with a very good theory of the business cycle, Keynes, a lot of his work seems quite similar to a lot of what Marx said, particularly in volume 2 of Capital, although Keynes claims never to have read Marx. So,
did we forget any contradictions?
Huh?
Did we forget any contradictions?
Probably.
Nature, class-based system, fall profit, business cycle.
I mean,
are there any new contradictions in the last 40 years, maybe?
I mean, I suppose the ecological one has changed a lot. I think the other thing actually that it's worth pointing to is this question of dispossession. And another German writer, Rosa Luxemburg, wrote quite eloquently on how this, you know, foundational act of capitalism, which was the dispossession of the peasants, is something that is happening constantly throughout the history of capitalism. And David Harvey also writes about this as well. He talks about accumulation by dispossession. And what that really means is creating avenues for accumulation, for profit making, where previously, you know, those systems or those processes had been governed in such a way as to insulate them from capital. So this is things like, enclosing land in the global south, so big land grabs in parts of the world where property rights aren't very clear, but it's also things like privatization, right? So when you have areas of kind of social activity that are insulated from the market, taking those out of the public sector and putting them back into the market is an act of dispossession. When you take people's social housing away, when you privatize healthcare, you are dispossessing people of something that they were able to rely on to have cheap or for free, and putting it into the market and making them pay for it. And that actually is obviously the foundation of neoliberalism, and it undermines, it is in itself creates contradictions, because if you have a workforce that cannot afford healthcare, you have an unhealthy workforce which is less able to do the things that they need to do in order to keep capitalist production going. And you see this in the US where you have, massive inequalities in health outcomes, in income and wealth, and the way that kind of undermines the foundations of society really and creates these big backlashes. You could see that as a contradiction as well.
So in your fascinating book, Stolen, you say the capitalists are running out of things to take. What are these things and why are they running out of them?
Well, I mean, you can only privatize something once, can't you? This was Thatcher famously said, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of someone else's money. But you could equally say of neoliberalism, the problem with neoliberalism is that you eventually run out of things to privatize. And yeah, I mean, that's obviously happened in the UK where we have...
Well, the NHS is still...
Yeah, just about, although it's being, being subject to marketization.
There are still some things to take.
Yeah, there are definitely still some things to take.
But eventually...
If things continue to go the way they are, then there won't be at some point.
What would they do if everything is privatized?
Well, I mean, the strategy with the NHS is less mass privatization of the kind that you saw with British Rail and more the slow, steady defunding of NHS services so that they become worse and more difficult to get to because you get extremely long waiting lists. So people then get private health insurance. Wealthier people get private health insurance. And when wealthier people stop using the NHS, then it becomes easier to take more money out of it and make it less good and less viable, which then, reduces support for it and allows you to kind of pass all bits of it off to the private sector.
Is inequality, massive inequality, like in the UK or in Germany here, two families own as much wealth as the bottom 42 million people. Is inequality a bug or a feature of capitalism?
It's a feature.
Why?
Because it's a feature of any class-based society. I mean, if you think about what capitalism entails, where do profits come from? Profits come from, the exploitation of people and resources by a small number of people who own the things that we need to produce everything that we have in society. As long as those people own those things, they will be the ones getting the profits and they will be the ones that will be getting richer at the expense of everyone else. As long as those resources that we need to produce things are unequally distributed, inequality will constantly increase. This is, again, just the same as Piketty's argument that throughout most of the history of capitalism, the returns to asset ownership are greater than the returns to labor. So if you are working for a wage, you are generally earning less than you would be if you just owned something and rented it out. And this is exacerbated, of course, by the tax system and by lots of different other things. But that kind of foundational divide between owners and workers means that you will always have inequality.
So, the political answer from the left or the Social Democrats, many places in the European Union is redistribution of wealth, like with a wealth tax, inheritance tax, universal basic income. Would that work? Is that a good place to start?
So, I mean, redistribution can go some way, obviously, to kind of ameliorate the...
Like take from the rich, give to the poor.
Yeah, exactly. It can ameliorate, obviously, the conditions that workers face at, the lowest paid sections of the economy. Also, if that redistribution is used to create and expand public services, so to take certain processes out of the market, that can be something that does go some way to rebalancing power in society. But ultimately, it's not going to fix any of these things. And we see this, and it's not just because, you can never redistribute enough. It's actually because, again, these questions of the overlaps between economic and political power. As long as you are allowing people to make loads of money and then taxing it, they will use that money to make sure that they don't have to pay any taxes. And we're seeing this, with the massive increase that we've seen in tax avoidance and evasion over the last 50 or so years. That isn't something that is ever going to change because political and economic power aren't separate. If you have an extremely wealthy elite that you allow to become extremely wealthy, you are generally going to have less redistribution because those people will use their economic power to shape the way that the political system works.
So the root of the problem is?
Capitalism, is class, is this divide between owners and workers. Who has the stuff and who has to sell their labor power?
And your answer is we need to democratize this. You also write about the financialization of capitalism. Is that a bug or a feature of capitalism?
More difficult to say. So, in many ways, financialization, as we experience it today, is the result of policy choices that have been made by successive governments. But some Marxist theorists, I think rightly, view it as something that happens inherently within capitalism, basically because as you start to get bigger firms, bigger, more powerful firms that make more profits, you have this mass of profits that exists within the system that has to be managed in some way. And the relationship between firms and financial institutions is what kind of starts the financialization process off. So say like you are a firm that is trying, you're a capitalist, you're trying to start a new business, you're trying to compete with businesses that already exist in this area, let's say manufacturing, right? A few hundred years ago, you might be able to do that based on your inheritance, right? Today, the amount of cash that you would need to be able to start a new manufacturing company would be huge, would be extraordinary, it'd be like more money than most people really have. So you'd have to go to the bank for a loan.
Yeah.
If you go to the bank for a loan, then you are in a relationship with that bank, and that bank has some influence over the way that your businesses run, right? Also, that process of getting leverage allows you to kind of increase your returns over the long run, because that's how leverage works. So the argument is that as capitalism develops, the relationships between banks and financial institutions become much closer, and that is the root of the process of financialization. There are then, lots of other mechanisms through which that ends up being realized. So like the stuff that I write about in this book is the changes that took place in the global economy between the kind of 1960s and 80s. And a lot of that had to do with changing rules. So like, for example, the removal of restrictions on capital mobility that allowed money to kind of flow seamlessly around the world. Changes to the way that banks work that allowed them to kind of create lots and lots of new money, create lots and lots of new debt. And obviously, do all the things that led up to the financial crisis of 2008. But there are definitely kind of inherent dynamics within capitalism that generate these tendencies towards financialization.
What's the problem with financialization? Or what is the problem with finance capitalism?
A lot of the problems are the similar sorts of problems that there are with capitalism in general. So, rising inequality, disparities of power, disparities of wealth. Some of the big problems with the specific problems of a kind of highly financialized economy have to do with the tendency towards crisis. So obviously highly indebted economies are much more prone to these kind of frequent and very severe financial crises. A big part of the way that the rentier class, so like the financial class is able to generate profits is through extraction from, other parts of the economy. So whether that's extraction from people in the private rented sector, for example, whether it's extraction from borrowers or whatever, it's like a process that kind of constrains economic growth over the long run and so exacerbates these tendencies towards crisis.
Did hedge funds, for example, exist before this finance capitalism?
Not in the way that they do today, because a hedge fund really is, the difference between, say, a hedge fund and a mutual fund has to do with regulation. So like funds in general, asset management and these kinds of funds are institutions that manage other people's money, right? So a mutual fund, say, is like an institution that manages like people's money. It might manage your pension or like the money of lots of different smaller savers. A hedge fund is generally something that started to manage the wealth of a few very, very, very wealthy people. And it, as a result of that, operates under less regulation. So it's able to kind of make riskier decisions than a mutual fund, which obviously invests on behalf of lots of consumers who it is alleged have less of an understanding of the way that financial markets work.
You write in your book that growth makes the dynamics of capitalism even more extreme when it comes to finance capitalism. Why?
The growth of the finance sector makes the dynamics of capitalism more extreme. it, for one, kind of exacerbates the ups and downs of the business cycle. And there's, some interesting thinking that shows that the way that debt is used when you have kind of pervasive deregulation of the financial sector makes these kinds of crises more likely. It also exacerbates regional and income and wealth inequality, so it makes that contradiction much deeper. And the way that the kind of the boom and bust dynamics of the finance sector work also end up giving us a much kind of less sustainable relationship with the environment. Also, if you think about the access to capital that a large and deep financial system provides to, say, the big fossil fuel companies, then exacerbates that contradiction. So yeah, in a number of different ways.
So the book of yours is called Stolen. What I was the first thing I thought, who stole what?
Yeah. So I guess the argument, you can look at this in a number of different ways. When I'm thinking about the kind of relationship between finance, capital, and the rest of the economy, it is effectively saying that a few very powerful people and a few powerful groups were really able to take advantage of some of these inherent trends within capitalism towards financialization to build an economy, build a society really that works in their interests. So yes, you can say that, it's wealth and income that has been stolen in the sense that it has been redistributed upwards. But also, I think, you can make an argument that the future has been stolen because, we live in a world where all the decisions that we're making about investment, about growth, about the future of our economy and our society are controlled by a very small number of people in their own interests and in the interests of kind of profit maximization. And that is in many ways an example of, the future of our society being stolen.
I'm sure a few people will be like, oh, Grace sounds like a conspiracy theorist. A few powerful people have stolen from us.
Yeah, I think the difference between having an analysis of the political structures that generate these repetitive patterns within a society and conspiracism is saying, it's not a few people got together in a room and said this is how society is going to work. It's more that the way that the way that our society is structured, the way that we organize all of our political and economic institutions systematically privileges the interests of a small group of people, i.e. the people who own all the stuff and their representatives within the state, over those of the majority of society. So you don't have to say these people intend to create an unfair society, although some of them actually do. You just have to recognize the fact that the way that power and wealth is distributed creates dynamics that reinforce that unequal distribution.
So my next thought was, okay, the book is called Stolen. Isn't stealing illegal, Grace?
Yeah. So there is can I really quickly go to the loo because I'm absolutely desperate?
We can take a break.
Can we take a break?
Let's take a 5 minutes.
Because before I'm literally I'm dying.
Can we take a break, Tyler? Yeah, sure. Yeah, we take a break. We're back in 5 minutes.
I was really hoping that.
No problem. Give me a sign. All right, we're back from the loo.
We're back from the loo. A very British expression, isn't it?
So the question was, isn't stealing illegal?
Yeah, so this was one of the criticisms, actually, of the title of the book from like more orthodox Marxist theorists were like, the problem with capitalism isn't theft, which is obviously a legal construction, it's exploitation. And so the whole argument of the kind of the ongoing injustices within capitalism stem from the fact that workers are exploited within the labor process. So because you are a worker, you've been dispossessed, you have to sell your labor power to survive. You have to enter into this agreement with the owners of the means of production to sell your labor power. Generally, you are being paid less in wages than what the capitalist is earning from your labor in profits. And that process of exploitation, which creates, alienation, which, denies the worker autonomy over their lives and their work, is the kind of foundational sin of capitalism. And then this whole idea of kind of theft is something that exists on top of that. So yeah, that distinction between exploitation and theft is important. But the book isn't really kind of rehashing like traditional Marxist theory. It is looking at these kind of broader questions of political economy and about like how we structure our society. So all of those, those things around exploitation and alienation and oppression are all in there. But the kind of call to arms, I suppose, of the book is really saying, our power, our autonomy, our capacity to kind of create the conditions of our own existence has been stolen, not just by bosses exploiting workers, but also by the construction of this powerful political economic elite who make all of the decisions that govern our lives and deny us autonomy and deny us a say in our future. It's really about how power has been stolen, I guess, and power has been centralized and taken away from people. And I think that is really the thing, more perhaps than these questions of exploitation, that resonates with people in the rich world today, because, there's obviously lots of people in most of our society today who barely earn enough to survive. But there are also more people who maybe do earn enough to survive in a way that they can just about keep their head above water. But there are much broader and deeper questions for them about power and autonomy. And I think the biggest problem that a lot of people would have with capitalism today, a lot of people in the rich world would have with capitalism today, is they don't feel that they have any power. And I think that's why, again, coming back to these questions around Brexit, why that slogan of take back control resonated so much is because as the average person in a capitalist economy, you get up, you go to work, you sit in an office or a call center or a shop all day. You have no power over anything you're doing. You're being told what to do all the time. You leave that, you go into, you interact with a state that is, saying you will do this, you will do that, is not giving you any accountability over the decisions that are being made about how society is structured. You are being kind of pushed around in every area of your life, in the way that you consume, in the things that you're kind of imbibing from the media. There's no control over any of these things really, or any of the kind of choices that you are presented with. You're presented with a very limited set of choices. And the power to reshape the conditions of your existence, the power to reshape the way that society works is centralized, is pulled up to the very, very top, such that democracy really ceases to be, it ceases to be something that has much meaning for people. And if you talk to people today about, what does democracy mean to you? Do you feel as though we live in a democratic society? A lot of them will just say no, because you vote in an election and the same sorts of people keep getting in charge. Nothing really seems to be changing. You're still exploited, you're still oppressed. The economy, society still seems to work in the interests of the same group of people. So that idea of power being stolen from people is, I think, really, really important.
So if my stuff gets stolen, I call the police. What happens when power gets stolen? Who's the police?
Again, the construction of the idea of theft, as you say, is based on a kind of legal set of, structures and institutions. But there's also, I guess, a kind of a moral and political element to it, right? Like if someone steals something from you, you have to have recourse to someone who is going to be able to enforce, in the capitalist society, your property rights over that thing. And for a lot of people, especially like if you're in the global south, for example, if you don't have recourse to those kind of sets of institutions to be able to enforce your rights, if you don't have the power to be able to enforce your rights, then it's kind of meaningless. And you see this especially in like societies where there's a really unequal access to justice, which is true in the US and increasingly in the UK as well, where sometimes even if you do get something stolen from you, you won't be able to do anything about it because you can't afford a lawyer, right? So you have to be able to have recourse to kind of enforce that right. And I think speaking at the level of the whole of society rather than just this kind of micro individualized level, being able to kind of take back that power requires building counterpower. So it's not simply enough to go down that legal route, right, for example, and say, like, we want to challenge the way this system works through the institutional mechanisms that exist within the system as it stands now. We have to be able to build forms of power that allow us to change that system, that allow us to act on that system and transform the way that it works, i.e. not just kind of trying to build change within it, but trying to like change the conditions in which that system operates. And that comes back to all of those things I was mentioning at the beginning about how we rebalance power in society by not just, by not just kind of tinkering around the edges, not just by tweaking institutions, but by demanding and by taking power, by demanding attention, by demanding change, really. And that's something that is quite difficult for people who have been told for a very, very long time that they are powerless and they are voiceless. I think in many ways, the first step in kind of challenging this model is just encouraging people to believe that they have power and encouraging people to come together in organizations and in groups and in institutions that give them a sense of their own power. So that might be joining a trade union, it might be joining a political campaign, it might be joining a political party, just something that allows you to come together with other people and recognize that when we join together, all of these different individuals, and neoliberalism has been about convincing us that we are just these kind of atomized individuals and we only have power as consumers or as, like these micro level individual repositories of rights. Pushing back against that means saying we have power together as the majority of people in the society. And if we organize, if we believe that we have that power and start building institutions and mechanisms to be able to realize that power, then that's how we'll start to change things.
So in your book, you spent a lot of time talking about the crash in 2007, 2008, and ever since quantitative easing by the central banks is holding everything together in this system. Can you quickly explain what quantitative easing is?
Yeah, this is a bit technical, but so important to understanding modern capitalism, because really pretty much everything that's taking place in financial markets at the moment is basically being shaped by the big four central banks. So the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the ECB. Because what those banks have been doing since the financial crisis, and in the case of the Bank of Japan, and to an extent the Fed before the financial crisis, is really just intervening much, much more in financial markets to prop up asset prices and to bail out institutions that have taken on too much debt, right? So after the financial crisis, you had obviously lots of banks that had spent the last several years issuing mortgage loans, packaging up those loans into various different forms of financial security, and selling those securities on, keeping some of them on balance sheets, and disguising the risk that existed within those securities. So disguising the fact that basically a mortgage-backed security or a collateralized debt obligation is built up of lots of different individual mortgages, some of which are good because the people who have that mortgage are going to be able to pay it back, some of which are bad because the people who have that mortgage aren't going to be able to pay it back. They're all bundled together in this one thing that you can buy. And the assumption is that the housing market's going to carry on booming forever. You're going to be able to continuously create more and more and more debt. When the housing market starts to level off, that stops being true. Suddenly the banks look at these securities that they have so many of, and they think, oh my God, we don't know what's in this. What if some of these borrowers, start defaulting, and we don't actually know what is in these securities that we've packaged up.
Did you see The Big Short?
Yeah, exactly. Just watch The Big Short if you want to understand this in a much more much more detailed and easy to understand and entertaining way. Yeah. So they had all these assets basically, and they suddenly realized that no one really knew what was in them, and they might be worth nothing at all. They could, be worth something. They could be worth, very little. No one really knew what was in them. And what that meant was that when the mortgage market started to turn, when financial markets started to tighten, investors and banks started to sell these things off en masse. And what you get, this is a kind of classic dynamic that happens within the financial cycle, is that when lots of people sell a thing at the same time, obviously the price of that thing goes down. And then if you have a lot of that thing, then your wealth goes down. So let's say if we're just talking about housing, for example, if you have a mortgage that is based upon the value of your house being, say, £100,000, and then the housing market turns, the value of your house suddenly is no longer £100,000, it's maybe £80,000, you might then have a mortgage that is worth more than your home. So you're kind of underwater, right? This same sort of dynamic takes place within the financial system, where a lot of the assets that the banks have basically suddenly start to lose all of their value. So what that means is that the banks have more liabilities than they have assets. They are effectively kind of underwater. They're bankrupt, basically. So the response was obviously the bailouts, nationalizations in some cases, kind of forced mergers in other cases. But what that process kind of started off was this period of asset price deflation. So in a financial boom, you have lots and lots and lots of debt being created. When you have more debt chasing the same amount of assets, you get inflation, right? Just as when you have more money chasing the same amount of commodities, you get inflation. If you have more and more and more mortgage debt chasing the same amount of housing stock, you get house prices rising. So on the upswing of the financial cycle, house prices and all of the securities that were created based on those house prices go up in value. When the crisis hits, everything falls in value. What central banks did in this crisis, what the Bank of Japan did in the crisis that preceded it, what the Fed did in the crisis that preceded that, was to say we're not going to let that process of asset price deflation happen. So we're not going to allow asset prices to fall. And the way that it did that was to basically step in and say we will purchase these assets. So firstly, obviously, there were the bank bailouts whereby, lots of different mechanisms were created basically to save the banks from the fact that these financial securities they had created became basically worthless. But after that, the way that central banks stopped this process of asset price deflation from happening, so the way that they stopped house prices from falling, the way that they stopped, equity prices from falling, was to say we are going to step in and purchase assets. And obviously, if lots of people are selling assets, their prices are going down. But if the central bank is saying, we're going to buy everything that these people are selling, it stops prices from falling. Mm-hmm. So the central banks basically said, we are going to step in and purchase, in the end, long-dated government bonds. This is basically, central banks always buy short-term government debt to influence short-term interest rates. Quantitative easing meant they stepped in and they bought lots and lots of government debt, right? So what that did was provide investors who had previously held that government debt with lots of cash, and those investors then took that cash and used it to purchase other assets. So they moved away from holding government bonds, the central banks held all the government bonds, and the private investors started buying equities, housing, corporate bonds. And obviously, what does that mean? Lots of people buying equities, equity prices skyrocket. So in the US, for example, the period after the financial crisis was the longest expansion for the S&P 500 in history. And that's quite remarkable because the economy wasn't doing really that well. You would usually expect kind of what's going on in equity markets to reflect what was happening to a greater or lesser extent in the rest of the economy. But because central banks were stepping in and purchasing all these government bonds and investors were then going out and trying to invest their money in other ways, equity prices skyrocketed. House prices also skyrocketed because in many ways they reflect the value of other assets. And corporate debt became very, very cheap because investors in financial markets who buy corporate debt were obviously more willing to do that. They wanted higher rates of return than they could get on other assets. So asset markets across the board went wild because of the role of these central banks. What we've seen happen over the last 2 years during the pandemic is that process on steroids. So if you look at what's happened in financial markets over the course of the pandemic, it's been absolutely insane. Like there is no way that during this massive, massive recession, we should ever have seen, you know, Amazon stock, like even, you know, if Amazon's business model was fundamentally sustainable, like we should never have seen the level of the increase in those share prices and in share prices across the board. That we have seen. And the reason for that has been that not only have central banks stepped in to purchase government bonds, as they did after the financial crisis, they're buying assets everywhere. Like the Fed, for example, is buying ETFs, which basically, like, it's basically purchasing assets in equity markets, in corporate debt markets, in student loan markets, in auto loan markets. It's buying up all of these different assets across the whole of the economy, basically. And in doing so, it's propping up consumer lending, business lending, it's propping up equity prices, it's propping up housing prices. And what this is doing is effectively making the wealthy who own those assets a lot wealthier. And this is basically why we've seen billionaire wealth increase so much over the last 10 years and over the last 2 years, even when the economy hasn't been doing that well. And it's why we've seen wealth inequality increase so much. It's been because the state, the central bank, has said, we are not going to let asset prices fall. Allegedly because they think falling asset prices would be bad for the economy, but arguably really because if asset prices were to fall too much, it would threaten the profits of big banks and big corporations.
I remember 5 minutes ago I asked you to easily explain quantitative easing, but it's much more complicated. But maybe that's a feature of it as well.
Yeah, it's why
it has to be complicated. So
exactly, it's why people don't understand it. I mean, basically, all you have to really understand is central banks claim that the only thing that they really do is set short-term interest rates and do some regulation of financial markets, right? But what central banks are actually doing is targeting asset prices. So an asset could be anything from a stock to the value of your house to, you know, any of those kind of investments that you might have, the value of your pension pot, whatever. Central banks have basically all but said, we won't let asset prices fall. And what that means is they're basically guaranteeing the wealth of the people who own those assets.
Doesn't that have to stop at some point? And does the whole quantitative easing...
That is the question on everyone's lips. Does it have to stop? Who knows? It certainly looks as though it's becoming less and less effective. So, you know, the more that asset markets tear away from what's going on in the real economy, the more central banks have to spend, the more money they have to create in order to keep that process going. So it's becoming less efficient, less effective over time. There is a question as to whether or not at some point financial markets will maybe stop paying attention to what is going on, you know, to basically policy, to central bank policy, and start saying, well, actually, you know, this is going to be less effective, so we need to start rethinking our investments. We need to start thinking about whether or not the assets that we hold are actually this valuable. But really, I mean, central banks, and particularly the US Federal Reserve, are so powerful because they have this capacity to really like structure what goes on in financial markets and to issue the currency on behalf of the state. Especially, you know, in the US, the Federal Reserve is the bank of the most powerful country in the world. It's extraordinarily powerful. They can, to a significant extent, really determine what happens within financial markets. Can they do that forever? I don't know, but they're certainly going to try.
I mean, the last bubble bursted in 2007, 2008. Are we in another bubble? Or is that,
well, I mean, really,
is that creating a new bubble?
Really, the last bubble was never properly allowed to burst. It started to burst and it looked as though things were going to get really, really bad, like Great Depression 2.0. But the central banks then stopped. They kind of grabbed the bits of the bubble and started like putting it back together.
But every bubble has to burst at some point.
Well, that's what people think. But does it? Does every bubble have to burst?
Well, I'm asking you. Question. You're the expert.
Well, really, the only way of being able to define a bubble is that it eventually bursts.
What does the Marxist theory say to that?
Well, I mean, there's less actual Marxist theory on the particular dynamics of financial markets, just because they become so much more complicated in the 150 years since Marx was writing. But, you know, the way that you define a bubble is that it bursts, right? So if a bubble doesn't burst, then by definition, it's not a bubble. Because the reason that the way you define a bubble is basically like the value, let's say the value of like a share, for example, a share in a company is supposed to be a reflection of the profitability of that company over the long run, right? So if investors buy a share in a company, it's because they think that company is going to be very profitable. It's going to distribute a lot of money to shareholders over the long run. The definition of a bubble would be that the value of that share rises way beyond the profits that that company could expect to generate over the long run, right? Now, that bubble bursting would be investors all suddenly thinking, oh, wait, this company isn't actually very profitable, selling all the shares, and then, you know, that company becoming unprofitable or potentially going under. If we have a situation in which the bubble is so, or in which, you know, sentiment is so untethered from what is actually happening within that corporation. So like, you know, the value of an Amazon share, for example, the value of like Tesla, for example, which has like a tiny portion of the car market and is just extraordinarily valuable. At this point in time, obviously, there is a massive distinction between the underlying profitability of that company and its share price. But investors are betting that that company is going to become really, 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 really profitable tomorrow. The issue is that by inflating the value of that share, they potentially create the conditions in which that company can become really, really profitable tomorrow, because inflating the value of the share means that the company is able to borrow more, it's able to invest more, it's able to, you know, do all the things that it would need to do in order to become a very, very profitable company tomorrow. So there is a chance that the bubble in like tech stocks, for example, might not burst, because these companies will just, you know, end up being able to do all the things that they need to do to become, you know, Amazon will just become this like massive everything store that basically controls like huge swathes of the world's economy. I think, and you know, if central banks carry on stepping in every time the market starts to turn, then that becomes more likely. It would be historically, though, extremely unusual for the kinds of valuations that we're seeing in financial markets not to be corrected at some point. Now, I don't know whether or not central banks have the power to stop that correction from taking place ever. What I do know is that most of the apparatus of the American, British, states, and the European Central Bank is currently directed towards making sure that correction doesn't take place.
So you want the democratization of central banks?
Yes.
What would that change?
Well, I mean, firstly, it makes what's going on within these banks, it forces them to be much more transparent and accountable. I mean, like a big part of what's going on today is going on because no one understands what's happening. Like if it was much clearer that these central banks are basically propping up asset prices in a way that is making the rich richer, people would be more angry about it. But because it's so complicated and difficult to explain, people kind of don't really understand that. And yeah, kind of democratizing central banks either by kind of introducing some measure of democratic accountability via the state, or by, you know, having like a citizens' assembly, for example, that would be scrutinizing the actions of these central bankers, that would force these issues out into the open. So that would be one way it would change things. It would also help to insulate, because at the moment, central bankers are very, very close with the people they are supposed to be regulating, or like the behaviors of the people they're supposed to be influencing. It's very easy for powerful financial interests to, it's not very easy, but it's much easier for powerful financial interests to influence the decisions of central banks than it is an ordinary person. Whereas if you introduce a measure of democratic accountability into that process, you don't level the playing field, because there's obviously big imbalances of knowledge, but you at least give people the potential to be able to influence that process much more.
So we're almost at the end. Hans is gonna come soon with the audience questions, but let's talk about in the end about democratic socialism. I mean, you say now's the time for a change. I mean, the crisis is always a time for change. What are the preconditions for democratic socialism?
Well, I mean, first, it's really all these questions around power, because democratic socialism isn't something that you can just introduce with the flick of a pen or of a keyboard, or even an election. You have to actually be able to build power throughout society, because ultimately, even if a left-wing party, let's say, the Labour Party under Corbyn had won the 2017 election, that would not mean that it would just be able to do socialism. It would have to spend a huge amount of time building up the political foundations for that project by doing things like strengthening the labour movement, like constraining the power of corporate and financial elites. It
would take years or decades.
It would take a very, very long time. So really, I mean, we have to start that work now, even prior to accessing state power. We have to be able to, which is why it's so important for people to get organized, to get involved in a movement, any movement, to join a trade union, to basically come together with other people to start trying to, build power and take control over these important institutions. Because we are at the moment, as a society, as most societies, very, very fractured. And this was obviously the whole goal of neoliberal political economy, was to make us conceive of ourselves as individuals, as separate, as consumers, as homeowners, rather than as part of a class, rather than as part of a majority, as part of a group that would be capable of mobilizing to change society. So pushing back against that pervasive individualism that has come to characterize most capitalist economies over the last 40 years is really step one. And it requires organizing. It requires the boring, daily work of getting out and doing actually what we've seen recently in Berlin, that campaign to expropriate corporate landlords. That's an amazing example of collective action and solidarity. And even if,
and the new Berlin government is fighting against.
Exactly. Even if it doesn't end up happening, you've still got people out in a campaign, building power and building links and connections and movements that will provide the foundations for any political project that will do something bigger in the future.
So earlier we were talking about the contradictions of capitalism. Are there contradictions of democratic socialism?
Well, I mean, Grace, we don't know yet. I'm sure that there will be. There already are. There are, I wouldn't say contradictions, but there are a lot of difficulties in trying to organize people in a society as fractured as our own. And there are a lot of difficulties in trying to organize the marginalized and the oppressed and the exploited. Because there are a relatively small number of people who own all the stuff and who, have vast amounts of control over our political system. So it's much easier for a lot of them to be in the same room and figure out what they want to do. That can happen actually in the case of the financial crisis, when you have all the bankers in the room with the Federal Reserve deciding what wants to go on, what they want to go on. Or it can happen in a much more kind of diffuse way through, lobbying organizations, through, enterprise organizations like institutes of directors, through the media, through this broad set of institutions that provide the foundations for the capitalist elites to coordinate and to discuss and to think about things. Davos COP that's happening right now is arguably exactly the same sort of forum. So the issue is that it's much easier for a smaller number of people to organize and a smaller number of people who have a very significant interest in making sure that things stay exactly as they are than it is to get a very diverse range of people from all over the world who conceive of themselves in very, very different ways to come together and recognize that they have a collective interest in things being different, especially when it's been decades of those people being kind of crushed and disempowered. I mean, in many ways, if you look at it just objectively, it is astonishing that socialist movements even exist anywhere in the world, given the massive disparities of power between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. It's astonishing that...
And after decades of neoliberalism.
Exactly. Like, it, I think, is a testament to the power of the human spirit and imagination, that even in the conditions that we exist in today, we are still desperately fighting and working together to try and imagine a different world and to try and build that world. I think it is a real testament to the fact that human beings want to be free. And even if we look at the way our world is structured and we think, God, that is just so difficult to ever imagine that things could be different, it doesn't stop us from trying to make them different.
It's funny because the liberals or neoliberals always use the argument of freedom.
And yet we live in a society of pervasive unfreedom. You know, not only, like, liberals conceive of freedom in terms of, like, you have rights. They don't really ever think of whether or not you have the material, social or psychological resources to be able to realize those rights. That can be everything from the fact that, you know, in the UK, an allegedly liberal society, there have been so many cuts to legal aid that it is impossible to access the law for many people, all the way through to the fact that, sure, you might have like the right to a university education, but you can't afford it. So does that right really mean anything? All the way through to actually, like, you know, you have the right to organize politically, but you're so weighed down and burdened by your job and your debts and just like trying to exist in a capitalist society that it becomes very difficult for you to actually make that right a reality. So the liberal view of freedom and of rights is so narrow and so, you know, constricted as to basically be meaningless in the kind of world that we live in today.
Is the general striking illegal in the UK as well?
So I think you're not allowed to, like, there's a lot of rules governing the kinds of strike action you can take. So like, yeah, I don't know if a general strike would be illegal. I kind of feel like it might be, but, yeah, the rules around what strike action you can take were changed a lot under Thatcher. That meant that, like, you couldn't do solidarity strike action, like all these different sorts of things. And also the recent policing bill has made protest as well much more difficult. So yeah, I mean, you know, this is again a real indication of the like hollowness of the idea of freedom that is put forward by liberals. It's like freedom unless you're a unionist, freedom unless you're a protester, like, because then we're gonna use like all the means at our disposal to prevent you from being able to exercise that freedom.
So you mentioned a couple of times the powerful elites are convening in Glasgow right now, talking about the climate and what's to be done. I mean, we know what has to be done, but the German government talks about a Green New Deal. The European Union talks about a Green Deal. What would Grace's Green New Deal look like in a perfect world?
So firstly, I would say it has to be a global Green New Deal. So any Green New Deal has to involve a transfer of resources and technology from rich parts of the world to poorer parts of the world to allow them both to decarbonize and also to mitigate the effects of climate breakdown as is. One person who is at COP who is brilliant is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. And she's said over and over and over again, low-lying and island nations are already being affected by climate breakdown, and we cannot access the resources that we need, not to decarbonize, but just to be able to put in place the mitigating measures that will be required to stop our country from literally going underwater. So like that kind of stuff, that kind of redistribution is very, very important. Also redistribution of technology. So often, you know, the technologies that we would use to fight climate breakdown are under patents that mean that they can only be used by multinational corporations in the global north. So that needs to change. So it has to be global. The second thing is that it has to be...
But isn't that the same argument that our conservatives and neoliberals are like, oh, unless China is doing something, why would we do something? I mean,
no, because Because it is less about saying we need to wait for everyone else to do their bit first, which obviously isn't true, because obviously when you look at per capita emissions, China is doing remarkably well, and knows that has to do well.
They always make the same argument. It has to be a global thing.
Yeah,
otherwise
but
we're
they make that
disadvantaged.
argument to basically say, so we don't have to do anything,
Yes.
right? Whereas my argument is that we have to do stuff, but we also have to make resources available to those countries that want to do things but can't do things because they don't have access to the finance. That's much more of a problem than countries being unwilling to decarbonize. If you're talking about countries that are unwilling to decarbonize, then look at the United States. Like, that's the worst offender in terms of per capita emissions and like the refusal to decarbonize. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing anything. It just means that we should be making resources available for other states to be able to do this as well. And most other states want to do this because it's states in the global south that are on the sharp end of climate change, like the Sahel, massive risk of desertification. Like most of the parts of the global south that are going to be, most of the parts of the world that are going to be subject to these extreme weather events that are going to become more likely are in the global south. The fact that climate change means it's going to be much more difficult to produce and harvest food in the way that we currently do, that's going to affect the poor. So these states largely want decarbonization. Even in China, like just things around air quality are like huge concerns for Chinese people, which mean that they want to kind of start making the transition towards a more environmentally sustainable world. It is often a question for many of these poorer countries of a lack of resources to be able to do that, not just to decarbonize, but actually to mitigate the effect of climate breakdown.
All right, almost at the end. Hans is coming up. 4 small questions.
Okay, shoot.
Will artificial intelligence save or destroy capitalism?
All technologies are the way that the impact of any technology is dependent upon the social relations that exist in the society in which it is developed and implemented. So no technology is just neutral. Like the way that technological development happens in a capitalist society is premised upon the needs of capital. So it's not that we have technological innovation that's oriented towards the social good. We have technological innovation that is oriented towards the private good, towards profitability.
But I was thinking about the people who own the stuff.
Yeah.
Developing artificial intelligence so they can replace the people who work for them.
Yes. So this, like that broader point around the way that technology works depends upon the society in which it is developed, means that anything from automation to artificial intelligence to the promise of big data to, the blockchain, all of these things are going to be implemented in such a way, unless we challenge this, in such a way as to augment the power of capital and generally to disempower workers. So unless we change the structure of society, then AI, automation, all these other things will just end up reinforcing inequalities of power and wealth.
What do you think of Bitcoin and the crypto trend?
I think there are certain potentially useful applications for blockchain technologies, but I also think that most of the way that the crypto market works privileges the interests of big, powerful financial institutions and a small number of very lucky retail investors who are able to get in on the ground. I also think that crypto is overvalued in the same way that every other asset is overvalued and potentially more than those other asset classes. So I would watch out if
It's a bubble.
Yes. And again, the fact that it's a bubble means that, we can only say it's a bubble when that bubble eventually bursts for the reasons that I've just said. But yeah, basically, I mean, if we get a turn in asset markets in general, that will affect cryptocurrency more than it would the average equity, for example.
I don't know how it is in the UK, but in Germany, a lot of young people are being pulled into getting EFTs, getting into the stock market, even with small, you're buying small stocks or something.
Yeah, okay, right.
What do you think of that development?
I mean, this is a central part of the way that neoliberalism is supposed to work. So the whole foundation of neoliberal political economy is about creating this class of mini capitalists who have some sort of ownership stake, whether that's in a house or in a pension fund, and who therefore have an interest in the continuation of the status quo. So, there are these narratives around, like, for example, crypto, where people say, oh, look, I was able to make hundreds of thousands of pounds off a cryptocurrency. Therefore, crypto is this kind of revolutionary thing that is going to completely and utterly transform the balance of wealth and power. But actually, it is just reinforcing neoliberal social relations, because ultimately only a small number of people will ever be able to do that, both because only a small number of people will ever have the savings that you would need to invest to make the kinds of return that these people are making, but also because, the wealth of people who have all these assets is premised on the fact that not everyone has them. Like, if everyone had, a share in all the big companies, then they would be effectively worthless, right? We would have moved towards a system of socialized production because we would all have an ownership stake. So the wealth of the people who do own stuff is premised upon the fact that not everyone can have access to that wealth.
Okay, and Tyler, my producer, also read your book.
Oh, cool.
The last few weeks, and he wanted me to ask you, what is cybernetic socialism?
This is
He found it in your book.
Yeah. This is a cool
cybernetic socialism.
So in Chile, under Allende in the 1970s, who was a democratic socialist actually, and who was ultimately deposed in a coup backed by the CIA that brought in the ruthless Pinochet, who threw people out of planes in his drive to develop an autocratic neoliberal society. But before that, Allende was building this model of kind of decentralized democratic planning, which used cybernetics, which is basically a kind of a way of applying systems theory to manage production without completely centralizing control of the production process within the state. So it's basically a kind of network whereby, in Chile it worked by basically like factories would submit information about what they were producing to a kind of central organization that would then be able to kind of coordinate and send out messages to all of these different factories that were governing themselves and kind of deciding themselves what they were going to produce, rather than having like a plan that was written at the beginning of the year or the beginning of 5 years, as you would in, for example, the Soviet Union, that would not give anyone any autonomy and would not be able to respond to different kinds of conditions.
So it's decentralized planning.
Exactly. Yeah.
And finally, last question, Tyler wants to know, what is luxury communism?
Yeah, so this is my friend Aaron wrote a book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism, which is great and I would really recommend people reading. And it's basically about how we apply the potential power of the technological innovation that has taken place within capitalism towards realizing a society in which everyone, of public luxury, rather than kind of private luxury. So, if we were able to this is, the Marxist argument that we will ultimately get to a point in the development of capitalism where the conditions are created for us to move to socialism, where we have so much wealth and have so much control over the production process that will be able to create a condition in which people don't have to work very much because, yes, automation has taken place, but rather than that dispossessing people, because we all own the robots, and therefore, are able to kind of coordinate how that process is developed and redistribute the rewards, then we're able to work less and do things that we enjoy and enjoy public goods and, like good public services in such a way that really kind of redefines the idea of luxury.
Well, for you, this was work as well. I hope you still enjoyed it.
I did. It was great. It was like the longest interview I've ever done, but I've had a really good time.
It's already 3 hours.
Amazing.
And now the audience questions.
Cool.
From Hans. Hans has never spoken English in my show.
Really?
So this is the first time. I'm very excited.
That's rubbish. I did. If you remember the interview with Mr. Böhm.
Oh.
Yes, right? Now
So the second time. Okay. Still.
On my show.
That looks like a lot of questions.
Bad excuse.
And I don't know how you read your handwriting, Hans. It looks
Nobody knows.
classic journalist.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I wouldn't even need any crypto. Nobody would be able to read my diaries if I wouldn't write one. Okay, so let's start with an easy question by Raphael. He wants to know, what does your dad think about your job? Is there a lot of discussion going on in your family about your positions, your demands?
I sometimes joke about the fact that like I'm arguing for policies that would mean that my parents had to, pay way more tax. But they love that idea. They think it's great. They think the system is just as unjust as I do. No, they're really proud of me. They, a lot of the values that I have come from them basically. And they are very invested in building a fairer society.
Uh-huh. So I understood that your dad is kind of coaching leading people.
Yeah.
Any conflicts with them? Do they?
I think some of his clients have said, I saw your daughter on whatever the other day. Yeah. But I think, what's like a lot of the time they just, see me and they think, oh, well, that's a really passionate voice for social justice. They don't think, oh, I'm scared that she's going to, expropriate my business. Partly because, they know that that's never going to happen like in, the foreseeable future because we haven't got to that point yet. But it's never, as far as I'm aware, caused any conflict. I think people have just been like, I think a lot of his clients think it's kind of cool.
Yeah. Another question, well, this is my question. You dedicated your book to your grandparents, grandfather and grandmother, by different reasons. Why?
My grandfather, as I've spoken about in this interview, was kind of my hero growing up. So he was, this communist who was like rebellious when he was young, like I was. He ran away from home when he was like 14, went and joined the Merchant Navy and traveled around the world, read the Communist Manifesto, came back, joined the trade union movement. And he was really kind of very intelligent and a really kind of harsh critic of the system. And we would often kind of have discussions when I was younger. And I feel like he really pushed me to ask the kinds of questions that I've really been asking ever since. And my grandma is just a very feisty and opinionated and assertive woman who I think gave me a model of how to exist in a world. Obviously, as a woman, she would have been growing up being told, sit down, shut up, know your place. And she kind of never really did that. So, yeah.
She's your personal role model for being a strong woman?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So there is kind of a $1 million question from half fly or halfy, I don't know. How can we realistically transfer into a non-capitalistic world with all the private growth interests? One country can politize this direction, but won't the privates just switch to another country?
Yeah, so this is the question of how you transition towards socialism in like a globalized world. And it's a very difficult question, and it's certainly a live question and was a live question when I was involved in policymaking within the Labour Party. Part of this has to do with policies that you can pursue. So, for example, you can restrict capital mobility. Obviously, you can't do that if you're in the European Union, but in other parts of the world, you can restrict capital mobility, which prevents people from kind of moving their assets abroad. The other thing that you can do is actually just accelerate the transition to common ownership. If say like HSBC, for example, in the UK is a bank that consistently threatens to up sticks and move abroad. Like if we were to develop a really expansive public financial system, we wouldn't need HSBC, which, by the way, is constantly being hauled in front of courts for like facilitating money laundering and breaking the law and stuff. So actually it's probably like a negative force in society more broadly. So kind of building up alternative institutions, public institutions, can be a way of getting around some of those issues. But ultimately, what really needs to happen is to like the build up of international solidarity between socialist governments. And there are some already, particularly in parts of Latin America, who have been pursuing a kind of moderately democratic socialist agenda for quite some time now, and who, would really benefit from the support of a socialist government in a wealthy, powerful country that was able to have much more influence over the way that the international system works. Because really what is required is a fundamental rewriting of the rules of globalization.
Yeah, that's a question. So far right now, someone who just owns millions or billions of dollars or any other currency, he or she could just say, okay, when when Great Britain is going to go socialist, my money is going somewhere else. This could still happen. And what would this mean for the transformation? Because it could ruin an economy which you would need as a functioning economy for the transition.
Yeah, because it's what I mentioned, you can control capital mobility. We aren't used to thinking about this because we have rules at the moment that were written by people who want to be able to move their money all over the world. Yeah. But you can stop people from moving money all over the world, and you can actually tax people when they try to move their money out of the UK or out of a particular country. Again, you can't do that in the Eurozone or in the European Union because there are these limits on, you have to have capital mobility. So that is more of a problem if you're a European country. But, you could probably just break the law and then see what happened.
Seriously wants to know, seriously probably, what does a post-capitalist world look like and how far away are we from replacing capitalism?
I have absolutely no idea.
Honest
I
answer.
do know that, a socialist world is a world in which you have a real sense of what it means to be free. It is, I would say, a world in which human flourishing is placed above profits for the few. It is a world in which we respect and steward and care for one another and our planet. It's not a world without problems or without difficulties or without challenges, but it's one in which people acknowledge that we have to work together to solve those challenges collectively.
Related to this, critical questions by a Twitter account, Make Better Films. Yes, do so. If capitalism is bad, why has it led to immeasurable prosperity in almost every category? Saying less child labor, higher wages, access to electricity, technology, innovations that make our lives easier, etc., etc.
Well, I mean, this relates to the question that that Thilo asked earlier, which is, do you want to just go back to feudalism? And again, no, the Marxist theory is that you have to progress through capitalism to get to the conditions that you need to implement socialism. So the argument isn't capitalism has never produced anything of value. Capitalism produced loads of things of value. It's created kind of extraordinary technological innovation. And, a lot of the kind of social transformations that have been won within capitalist economies, like, the limits on the working day, socialized healthcare have been fought for by unions and by people, so they're not the result of capitalism. But capitalism has produced some extraordinary technological innovation, certainly. The argument is that we are getting to a stage within human history where the drawbacks of organizing our economy in this way now outweigh the benefits for most people.
Is that so? There's another question about the same topic, more or less, by Leave Debt 95. A popular pre-capitalist argument is the poverty rate has been on a constant downhill for the past 20 years. How do you respond to this?
Well, I mean, in largely the same way. Although I think it is important to bear in mind that the progress that we've seen, particularly in the last 50 years on poverty alleviation, has not been as good as we might have hoped for. And a lot of that progress has come from within China, where you have a completely different model of organizing the economy than the one that we do today. So, you have basically much more kind of centralized state planning and the allocation of resources by the public sector rather than by the free market.
You know that the United Nations are quite proud in saying that in following their Millennium Goals, the ratio or the rate of poverty has been reduced enormously.
Again, mainly because of what's happened in China, which has not been a country that has been adopting this kind of neoliberal free market approach. It's been saying, no, actually, a lot of, the reason for the reduction in poverty in China is because they've prioritized reducing poverty.
Nie wieder, which means never again, wants to know, why has socialism and Marxism become a shame in the public discourse?
I mean, I think probably a lot of it has to do with, especially among older people, the associations between socialism and like the USSR, and like those kind of quite autocratic and centralized forms of planning, which didn't have that element of democracy in them. And I mean, ultimately, may have had to. If you look at a country like Cuba, which has been basically under siege ever since its inception, it's hard to imagine, how it would have survived had it not been for some of the more kind of authoritarian measures. Not that that makes them okay, but it's kind of understandable that a society that organizes itself in that way becomes less free and in the public imagination is associated with less freedom. I think, though, that is starting to change among younger people who recognize that actually this transition to socialism is about deepening democracy. It is about making the promise of democracy real. It's about extending democracy into more areas of society. It's not about the kind of authoritarianism that we might have seen in the past.
Quite a lot of people would like to know your take on universal basic income, which means unconditioned basic income.
Yeah, so I am broadly in favor of mechanisms to decommodify the means of subsistence. So for me, I'm not actually massively in favor of universal basic income because I don't think that it would undercut capitalist social relations in the same way as providing people everything that they need to survive for free, right? Because it creates a very different mindset. UBI is in many ways quite a neoliberal innovation, a quite neoliberal way to reduce inequality, which is why a lot of the tech bros support it. Because it's about saying, right, here you go, here's some money, you go away as an individual, you spend it however you like. If you lose it all, that's your fault. If it costs you more to survive, that's your fault, whatever. Whereas another way of using that same money would be to say, obviously we could still have a system of social welfare, but rather than just giving people money, we will say that everything that anyone needs to live is provided free at the point of use. So free healthcare, free transport, free broadband, free or very, very cheap social housing, a kind of national food service that will provide people with food if they couldn't afford that, free social care, all of those things that you'd need to survive in a decent way would be free. And that would create a very different subjectivity than just giving people money, because it encourages people to conceive of themselves as part of a society in which we have obligations and responsibilities towards one another, and therefore all commit to making sure that no one is ever left behind.
But you share, I understand you share the idea of having a system which is giving back dignity and decency to regular people, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. What about, Andreas wants to know, what about the theory that modern
monetary theory.
That comes later.
Oh, okay.
That modern day millionaires are taking the spot in society which used to be occupied by aristocrats and nobility in ancient times, which means new feudalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of truth to this, and I write a little bit about this in the book. I mean, the whole idea of capitalism is that, this inequality is premised upon there being growth and kind of technological innovation and increases in productivity. And that is how you will generate profits. That is how, a capitalist business is supposed to generate profits. But we've started to reach a point at which power has become so concentrated in our society that we have a few very, very powerful corporations, a few very powerful financial institutions, that a lot of them don't need to innovate in order to be able to make profits. And when you have rising profits with stagnant investment, with not particularly applicable innovation, then what you're seeing is not wealth creation, but wealth extraction and a transfer of wealth from consumers to monopolists, from workers to monopolists, from private renters to owners, from people who have debts to people who lend to them. And that form of kind of extraction without innovation is something that is increasingly characteristic of our economy.
Yes. On the other hand, the traditional feudalism was characterized not only by a way of pre-capitalist or early capitalist production, but also of people, a majority of people who had no rights. And is this coming back in the new feudalist categories which you are describing?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a vast majority of people in, if you look at the world, I would say most people either don't have the kind of rights that we would expect them to have, or at least don't have the capacity to realize those rights and to kind of live those rights. And that, again, I think is getting worse because of that concentration of power, because our political systems are being corrupted and captured by, basically elites, like corporate and financial elites.
Now, Rick Patterson wants to know, what do you think about the MMT?
Here we go. Yeah, so I'm going to try and answer this briefly. I mean, I think every single time I do an interview, I get asked the following questions. What do you think of crypto? What do you think of UBI? What do you think of MMT? And I think proponents of these interventions all tend to think that they are ways of fixing everything, right? That if everyone just adopted UBI, if everyone just adopted MMT, it would completely transform capitalism and everything would change. But I actually think it comes back to this question, the last question that Thilo asked me, which is, about automation. Like, how will that change capitalism? Unless you change who has the power, almost anything that you can do isn't really going to fundamentally shift capitalist social relations, and actually probably isn't even going to get implemented if it would shift capitalist social relations. So you can't view these like policy changes as just, one-stop shop fixes to all of the problems that exist within capitalism. You have to focus on the hard work of organizing and of building power. So having said all that, MMT has some interesting insights into the nature of money. So the fact that banks create money, the fact that the central bank can issue currency to fund public spending, and the fact that the balance between different sections of the economy, so sectoral balances within the economy have to even out, which means that if the state borrows less, then the private sector has to borrow more. There's a lot of interesting insights in there. But the idea that often comes out of MMT, which is that everything's possible if you just create endless amounts of money to do whatever you want, isn't true. It's not true of most states in the world. It is to an extent true of America, but even in the US, you can't just endlessly create money to put resources to use. There are constraints that exist because of resources.
I guess everybody knows that kind of cartoon where a figure is running along a road and then comes to a canyon and just goes on running, though there is no ground anymore which it can run on. It just goes on running, and the cartoon, it will not fall down because it's not aware that there is no solid ground. Is MMT in some way comparable to that situation?
So again, MMT is the theory rather than like the policy solution. But I mean, in many ways it is kind of true, because we've seen the state create trillions of dollars through quantitative easing, and that hasn't got to the point of like falling off the cliff just yet, but that doesn't mean that it never will. I think, broadly, it's very elusive to just focus on questions of money within a capitalist society, because money seems to be the thing that is the most important. But money is just a symbol. Money is a representation of value. Like, if you are not creating value, if you're not using money to create value, then you can do all the monetary interventions you want. It's not going to fundamentally change anything. So I think really looking beyond money to what money symbolizes and how money is used to put resources to work is really the thing that we need to be doing.
Arky797, what's your opinion on post-growth economy? It's an intensive discussion in the German left.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the binary between growth or degrowth is not particularly helpful, because they both center on GDP. GDP is not something that we should have more of or less of. It's just something that we shouldn't be measuring at all. So we need, yes, to probably have less consumption to move towards an ecologically sustainable society, but we also need other people to have higher incomes, and we need in other areas more investment. So I think it's less about more or less GDP and more about what we're measuring, more of some things, less of other things.
Close to that by Lena. Do you believe in green growth?
Again, green GDP growth, no, because I don't think we should be measuring GDP. In terms of, there being a way of achieving decarbonization while ensuring that the average person or, the least well off and average people have rising incomes and rising living standards. Yes, I do believe we can do that.
Close to that again, Lucas. I wonder if economic growth and sustainability can work together.
Again, it's a similar sort of question. If we're talking about GDP growth, probably not. But if we're talking about living standards and incomes, then I think yes.
Ali wants to know, do you see any positive trends in our economy which we are observing? If so, which ones?
I think one positive trend is the growth in something of a growth that we've seen in the labour movement and in organising in recent years. I think that's certainly a positive trend. I think that's probably the only positive trend. Other than actually, no, we are moving towards there being some progress on the climate. It's not nearly enough, and I wouldn't really characterise it as positive just yet, but we are certainly getting to a point where we might start to see some change, I hope.
That's a tricky question now. Do you believe in a real system change by insufficient handling of the climate crisis? So
as in like accelerationism. Yeah, this is a classic thing that some people say, like, just let the system collapse and then everything will fall down and we'll be able to reconstruct it. I don't believe in that, because most of the time when you have really deep and severe crises, it actually often makes people have less of an appetite for change because they just want things to go back to normal. So no, I don't think that, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Okay, which is your most severe fear about capitalism or big companies like Amazon? You've talked about Amazon, but is there anything, if you're talking your nightmare?
I mean, obviously the thing that keeps me awake at night the most is climate breakdown, because it is a terrifying prospect. But aside from that, the way in which these massive companies are generating control over our data and our lives is quite scary. A brilliant book on this actually is Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, and just looks at the extraordinary power that the big tech companies have over many, many aspects of our lives. And on top of that, you just have to look at the conditions faced by, if we're talking about Amazon, the workers in its factories. People have died in these factories. They've had severe injuries, and nothing has been done about it. And that is also pretty scary.
Some questions on the situation in the UK, especially Labour. What are the midterm perspectives for Labour after the current post-Brexit turmoil? And in this context, what happened to the Corbynistas after his defeat?
So, the movement is still around. It still exists. It's much more dissipated and dispersed because there's less kind of central leadership of it. And that is a problem. But, it still exists. And someone I knew from that movement, who's been around for a very long time, says that these things come in waves. The tide comes in and we move forward slightly, and then the tide goes out, and we just have to maintain where we found ourselves on the beach. We've just got to stay there and try and keep the movement together. And that's the point that we're at now. But the tide will come in again.
Oh, well, that's close to Engels' dialectic of nature, right? Okay, BMW Zepp, strange name. What do you think of the thesis that the theory that big finance in London City willingly supported Brexit to deregulate the financial sector in order to enable some kind of turbo-capitalism and a tax haven in Great Britain?
That's definitely true, but it is there's a divide between the big investment banks that largely didn't want Brexit to go ahead, although ultimately accustomed themselves to it because of the way that their business models depended on trade and investment treaties with Europe. But there was certainly a portion of more kind of extractive like more risky, I guess, financial institutions that could see a benefit in leaving the European Union, definitely.
Constance wants to know, what do you think about the Scots who want to leave the UK?
Well, at this point, I don't blame them. No, I mean, like my view on independence has always been, again, you know, like I am a Democrat. I believe that, you know, if there is a referendum in which people say they would like to leave the European Union, the United Kingdom, they should be able to do that. I personally would prefer it if they didn't, because Scotland is relatively progressive and it's good to have it in the UK. But, you know, ultimately, I think that's a decision that has to be made by the Scottish people. Last
question from Andrea. Some people say, yeah, she's known, meaning you, Grace is known to be Eurosceptic. I think it was visible in this discussion. Is there an alternative for European nations for global relevance? Or is the EU the only way, which means joining forces to become one global force, the only way?
I mean, I don't necessarily think it's progressive to have these European nations as they currently exist, united as this global imperial force. A big argument, obviously, that you hear a lot among European elites is we need the European Union because it makes us more powerful. And that is true. Like, being in the European Union makes certain heads of states within Europe much more powerful. It doesn't, of course, do that much for often, you know, the average person. So, yeah, I mean, basically, the concern of European leaders at the moment is in a world that is dominated by America, the existing superpower, and China, the rising superpower. Europe needs to collaborate in order to, you know, have a say in what's going on in the world system. But the way that the European Union is structured means that the elites at the top of that organization are much more concerned with their own power and prestige and, you know, winning those battles at the level of the global economy than they are promoting the interest of the people of Europe. Which is why I think that, you know, there needs to be clearly much more collaboration between people at a regional and at a global level. But cooperation between elites is not the same as cooperation between people, which is why I think we need this much more democratic version of the European Union.
There were some contributors who asked, why isn't she running for a political mandate or function?
People keep asking me this.
Yeah, sure. Wow.
I mean, like, Keir Starmer wouldn't let me at the moment. The current leader of the Labour Party would never, ever, ever let me get a seat. But maybe in the future. Currently, I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing. And yeah, as I said, I won't be able to run for as long as the Labour right is in charge of the party because they hate me. But if things change, then I would definitely be willing to run if we got a good leader again.
Could you be part of a new, not right, but left leadership of Labour?
I don't know. I mean, I have no ambitions to do that.
That's a very professional answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I think probably, you know, the leader of the Labour Party should probably be someone who is working class. But I, you know, am aware that there is a lack of talent and particularly of people who can kind of go up into the media and perform in the way that I am relatively good at performing. So on that level, like, I would be happy to kind of join up and support and provide that role, but I'm not like dead set on it. I'm not like, that's what I want to do with my life. I'm actually very happy with what I'm doing now, but if I needed to, then I would.
Grace, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your time, for your answers, for your visions. And thanks a lot, folks. I won't confuse you with any German sentences now. Everybody knows this format is only possible as you are supporting it, and those who did give us support up from the amount of 20 euros in the last month. It is they are mentioned in the finals, in the credits right now. So thanks a lot. Und bis zum nächsten Mal.